You're one of my most highly requested guests to have on the show.
I'm glad to hear that.
So you got some interesting theories on the pyramids, huh?
That is correct. A comprehensive theory that addresses the function of all of the Egyptian pyramids and other ancient structures across the world, specifically now focusing on some of the ancient stone circles of England and Ireland.
Okay. How did you get interested in the pyramids, and what is your theory?
So I've been interested in Egypt since I was a kid. I remember watching Raiders of the Lost Ark with my dad back when I was a kid in the 80s. And I always wanted to go to Egypt. I was always interested in archaeology. And I finally had the opportunity in 2017. I was working my first good corporate career job. And I had the opportunity to go. I could finally financially afford the trip to Egypt. And this was right after my godmother had passed away. And she was a huge influence in my life in terms of pursuing my dreams and fulfilling what I feel to be my destiny here on the planet, which was going to Egypt and inevitably moving there 5 years later. So 2017, I went on my first expedition to Egypt to investigate the alternative theories about the function of the Great Pyramid. And I contacted the late, great Yusuf Awian, who is still one of the most prolific tour guides in Egypt and basically the gatekeeper for the alternative Egyptology community. I definitely wanted to work with him as my tour guide, and I wanted to go to Egypt so that I could see the pyramids for myself and assess the idea that these structures were used to produce electricity, which is the most popular theory about the function of the Great Pyramid. However, as I began to explore the sites, specifically a location known as Abusir and the Pyramid of Neferkare, we were exploring the site and I found this red quartzite collection bowl and conduit system that runs from the pyramid itself underneath this huge floor of black basalt into this collection bowl. Mm-hmm. And that's when I began to develop the idea that they were producing and collecting aqueous solutions of chemicals. So generally speaking, my theory is that the Egyptian pyramids are a series of chemical reactors that were designed to produce at least a half dozen different chemicals in series. But they were powered by electric fields coming from lightning, which I'm sure we'll get to here in a little bit. So overall, that's my theory, is that the Egyptian pyramids were designed for chemical engineering and chemical manufacturing.
So what made you come to this conclusion about them being chemical processors and the bowls being collectors of chemicals? Do you have a background in chemistry?
No, so I have a degree in psychology and a minor in Spanish and just sort of a lifelong passion for chemistry and physics. And I was really inspired by first the collection bowl in Abusir. And then our next expedition was to go inside of the Red Pyramid of Dashur. And as soon as I went down into these reaction chambers, I noticed that there was chemical staining all over the walls inside of the Red Pyramid, which was very, very unusual. And typically the explanation for the staining is that it's somehow caused by bats. And I knew immediately when I heard that explanation that there's no way that was the actual explanation for what's causing this staining. And fast forward now 5 years later, we have a chemical analysis from samples of that staining that were taken from the walls of the chambers that conclusively prove it has absolutely nothing to do with bats. It is extrusions of metal compounds that are coming out of the stone itself due to high temperature reactions occurring inside of these chambers and fluctuations in temperature and pressure. So you got to imagine like a sponge, right? Squeezing out liquid material. So the stone itself has to be heated to a high enough temperature to be able to liquefy these compounds, and there has to be fluctuations of pressure inside of the structure that cause these extrusions to come out of the stone. So that was the first thing I noticed inside of the Red Pyramid that began to inspire the idea that these were designed for chemical reactions. The next thing inside the Red Pyramid is as you go through the sequence of chambers. So you get down the entry shaft, you're in the first chamber, and you'll immediately notice the smell of ammonia. Now, this smell of ammonia is typically explained as also being from bats. But my wife and I, we've been in plenty of other structures in Egypt that have tons of bats inside them. And the smell inside of these chambers, for example, Mastaba 17 in the Fayum Oasis, is filled with bats. And it smells like what you would imagine a cage full of rodents would smell like, right? Just imagine what that would smell. That's what a bat cave smells like. We've also been inside the Tomb of the Birds, which is this underground tunnel network that runs below the Giza Plateau, a very rarely discussed feature of the Giza Plateau that is critical to how this system operated. And it's basically a leach mining tunnel that was used to use acidic solutions that flowed through this tunnel to extract the metallic ore deposits that are inside of the Tomb of the Birds. But it's a bat cave now, and there's tons of bats that live in there. And again, it smells like a rodent cage. But inside of the Red Pyramid of Dashur...
And you've been down there?
Oh, yeah, yeah. It's technically what you would say an off-limits or forbidden area of the Giza Plateau, but I have videos on my channel, The Land of Chem, CHEM, of us going down inside the Tomb of the Birds. And
these are channels that run underground through the Giza Plateau?
Correct, yeah. So
how big are we talking?
So it's a pretty large, again, you know, the diameter of the opening of the tunnel is probably 15 feet by 15 feet.
Oh, wow.
So it's a huge tunnel system that runs from one side of the Giza Plateau directly toward and underneath the central pyramid of Giza. And these tunnels have been known about since antiquity, and the Roman explorers that were investigating the Giza Plateau called these things syringes. And the original name for the Giza Plateau is Rostau, which means mouth of the passages. So there's all of this nomenclature in regard to the Giza Plateau that is indicative of the knowledge of these underground metallic ore mining tunnels. And we did have an opportunity to go inside of this thing, and it was pretty wild because this whole tunnel is filled with iron ore deposits. And we also have chemical analysis that's been taken from a variety of sample locations across the Giza Plateau of these iron ore deposits, which nobody ever talks about these things, but they're a critical part of the operation of the Giza Plateau.
Is this a photo of them?
So this is actually the Osiris shaft, which we've also been down inside the Osiris shaft, which is another underground chamber system running below the Giza Plateau. This one is below the causeway of the Central Pyramid. But I do have some videos on my channel showing the inside of the Tomb of the Birds. But after this experience inside the Red Pyramid of Dashur, seeing the chemical staining and smelling this, it is pure ammonia. Again, we have those smelling salts over there, and it's the exact same experience. Mm-hmm. So you start in the...
You sure it's the same?
Let's take a whiff here and we can see.
There you go, brother.
It's very similar, and it's definitely not from bats. It is a completely different smell. It is pure chemical ammonia, as if you were to take a jug of ammonia of cleaning solution from underneath your kitchen counter, put your nose in it, and smell it. Mm-hmm. And it gets progressively stronger as you pass through the three chambers. So you get into the first one, the smell of ammonia is a little weak. You get into the secondary reaction chamber and it gets stronger. Mm-hmm. And then as you climb the stairs to ascend into the final synthesis chamber, the smell of ammonia is staggering. It's like putting your nose inside of that, inside of this final synthesis chamber. And in my opinion, you know, bats don't have a coordinated strategy for their urination plan, and they're all going to decide just to go into this one chamber and pee inside of this one chamber.
Right.
And people also say that it's because of the guards going down there and urinating. And I can assure you, it takes a good 10 minutes to get down the shaft into the Red Pyramid. It's a very laborious process to get down inside of these pyramid structures. And if you have to take a leak, you're just going to do it on the outside of the pyramid because it's a heck of a lot easier just to pee off the side of this thing or go into the desert as opposed to crawling down inside of the chambers. So that is a fallacious explanation of the cause of the staining and the smell of ammonia. And again, now we have chemical analysis thanks to my colleagues at the Abusir project, where they took probably hundreds of samples back in 2010 of a variety of different things throughout Egypt and all of the ancient structures around there. And they did chemical analysis of all this stuff. So we actually have some detailed information about exactly what these compounds are that are on the walls of the Red Pyramid. So it's definitely not from bats.
So when you were younger or something, did you just toil away with chemistry in your spare time? And because how do you know so much about chemistry and chemicals and all this stuff?
So it was really after I got back from this 2017 research expedition, I dedicated my entire life to the pursuit of understanding what I experienced in Egypt. I've always had a passion for chemistry and physics. It was one of my favorite courses as I was coming up through school, but I don't have any professional background in this. I literally immersed myself in learning everything I could about industrial scale chemistry to try to understand the processes that were occurring inside of the Egyptian pyramids. And by attempting to reverse engineer the Red Pyramid of Dashur using, I mean, it's literally Physics 101 are the basic principles of operation that go into making these chemical reactions work inside the Red Pyramid. So by attempting to understand all of that and immersing myself into trying to understand industrial scale chemistry, I gradually developed this knowledge over the past, so now it's been 7 years that I've been working on this. And I literally, you know, me moving to Egypt is a testament to how much I believe in this theory. So my first trip to Egypt was 2017. I also knew that there was a connection between the structures in Egypt and some of the structures in ancient Ireland, such as Newgrange and these so-called passage chamber tombs. So in 2018, I went to Ireland for a research expedition so I could see those structures up close in person and help finish writing my book. I published my book in 2020, and my intention was to go back to Ireland in 2020 for a follow-up research expedition. But as you know, the world was shut down at the time, and Egypt was one of the only places where you could still travel. So I went to Egypt. I went in 2020, 21, and 22 to continue developing my theory about the function of these structures, gather more data. And then in 2023, last year, I sold my car, I sold my house, I quit my career job, I sold everything that I owned, and I left for Egypt to move and live there permanently with basically 2 bags of clothes and a dream. And so again, that's kind of my testimony to how much I believe in what I'm doing. And now that
dedication.
So now my basic goal is just to, we go out to the sites every single week. We put out Sunday site visits of on-site explorations of all the Egyptian pyramids that are directly connected to attempting to explain my hypothesis on the function of these structures while you're actually looking at it and seeing it up close in person. So it's been a really cool experience living in Egypt, and probably the best decision that I ever made.
Okay, so
yes,
can you explain your hypothesis in a nutshell? Basically, you think that the Red Pyramid was manufacturing chemicals for what purpose? And what was the function of the other 2 pyramids?
Yes.
How did the whole thing work?
Okay, so there are 2 major pyramids in Dashur, the Red Pyramid and the Bent Pyramid.
Okay.
We also have the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, and then there are 3 different major pyramids on the Giza Plateau. There's actually 12 pyramids on the Giza Plateau. So there's a lot more than just the Great Pyramid up there.
Okay.
So let's start with the Red Pyramid.
Okay.
Ammonia is by far the most important chemical that we have synthesized in the modern day. So during the Industrial Revolution, chemical manufacturing on an industrial scale was being developed as a legitimate science. And one of the first chemicals that we synthesized on an industrial scale was ammonia. And ammonia is one of the most important chemicals that we use today for fertilizers. It completely transformed the modern world, being able to manufacture massive scale of fertilizer in terms of population expansion, and everything that we've seen in the development of the modern day is literally dedicated and dependent on our production of ammonia. Still to this day, we use ammonia-based fertilizers because it has a very high content of nitrogen. So the 2 pyramids in Dashur, the primary function for these 2 chemicals, which is ammonia and ammonium bicarbonate, is for fertilizer production. You got to feed the people. So I do believe that there was a massive civilization that lived in the upper eastern corner of Africa, basically what we know today as Egypt, and fertilizers would have been a huge part of what they were producing in terms of the chemical supply that they had. So now that takes me back to trying to reverse engineer the Step Pyramid of Saqqara. And I can show you some diagrams here. This will be a perfect place for me to jump into some of these presentations. Sure. So let me start with this so you can see the collection bowl at Abusir. So this is the pyramid complex known as Abusir, and there's 3 major pyramids out there.
Okay.
And the 2 that we're going to be looking at are the Pyramid of Neferkare and the Pyramid of Nayusare. So the reason I wanted to bring this up is to establish the function of the geology of the Egyptian pyramids. So predominantly inside of these structures, there's 3 types of materials, and all 3 of these types of stones have very specific functions. So when you're looking at limestone, which is the majority of the body of the pyramids are made from limestone. Limestone is a dielectric material that has the capacity for storing electric fields. Then you have red granite. Red granite is also a dielectric material, but there's a very special property about red granite is that it has high content of crystalline quartz. And a lot of people talk about the piezoelectric property of quartz in regard to the function of the Great Pyramid. But in my research, I've determined that it's actually something called the inverse piezoelectric property, where the stone and the quartz is introduced to an electric field, which leads to the production of ultrasound. So a lot of people talk about the sound properties of the Egyptian pyramids, and the big question is, how are these sound properties activated? Well, it's activated by the interface of these electric fields coursing through the red granite, causing vibrations within the quartz that produce ultrasound. And we'll get to that when we talk about the function of the Great Pyramid, which utilizes ultrasound as a sonochemical acoustic catalyst. So this is a sort of a breaking field in modern day chemistry where they're using sound waves to catalyze chemical reactions. And that'll be directly applicable to the conversion of sulfur dioxide into sulfur trioxide inside what I call the contact process chamber or the grand gallery of the Great Pyramid.
Okay.
So let me skip through. So this is black basalt, and this is going to be particularly relevant when we get back to the function of the Great Pyramid, because the Great Pyramid also has a black basalt temple floor on the eastern side of the Great Pyramid. And one of my most interesting discoveries was that black basalt.
When you say temple floor,
Yes.
where's there a floor?
Yep. So it basically looks like this. So this black basalt flooring.
You're saying like the base, the foundation of the whole pyramid is on this?
So it's just on the eastern side, very similar configuration to what you see here. And this is adjacent to the Pyramid of Userkaf in Saqqara. And I also have had special permission access into the Pyramid of Userkaf, which is also on my YouTube channel.
Okay.
And this is one of the locations where we discovered the mysterious blue stone of Egypt. There's a completely destroyed container that's made of this blue sandstone, which is a very unusual material. So black basalt, even in the modern day applications, is used as a material for heat storage. And there's tons of research that specifically references black basalt from Egypt being tested and analyzed for a material for heat storage.
Okay.
So here at the Pyramid of Nayusare in Abusir, there's this red granite or this red quartzite actually, red quartzite conduit system. So you're looking now at the inlet of this conduit system, and this red granite conduit runs underneath this black basalt temple floor in this direction, and it leads into a red quartzite collection bowl at the end of the conduit system. And the conventional explanation for this component is that it's for drainage of rainwater.
Okay.
Which to me doesn't really make a lot of sense, because red quartzite, it's not an exotic type of geology, but if you were just making a drainage channel, you would just carve it out of bedrock or limestone, and you wouldn't need to go through all of the extra effort of transporting this red quartzite to the site, carving it out of a much more difficult material to work with than limestone. And in my opinion, you don't collect rainwater. Right. So why would you be collecting rainwater drainage running off the side of your pharaonic burial? Again, the conventional story is that these things are pharaonic burials. So that explanation,
Pharaoh tombs.
Correct, right. So why would you want to collect the drainage water running off the side of your tomb?
So this little channel that's dug into this piece of rock here,
correct.
Water or liquid could drain through it, and what came off? What happens at the end right there?
Right. So this is the collection bowl.
Okay.
The conduit goes underneath this black basalt floor, and it deposits whatever they were collecting into this red quartzite collection bowl, which is exquisitely crafted.
Wow.
So they went through a lot of effort to make this component. And to me, this is not indicative of rainwater drainage. This is indicative of collecting something that had very particular importance to the civilization that built these things. And the first time I saw this, the immediate thought that popped into my head was aqueous chemicals, liquid chemicals, because it had to be something that was very, very important for them to collect it, and then they would do something with that chemical. Mm-hmm. So the reason that they've utilized...
Yeah, rain, if it rained, that thing would be overflowing in like an hour.
Right. And if you were, draining rainwater, you would just drain it back into the bedrock or back into the Nile River.
Right, exactly.
And you have a huge source of water, and they could definitely purify water. So you don't need to collect rainwater drainage when you're right next to the Nile River, which is a abundant source of water. Mm-hmm. So that never really made sense. So this is the first artifact that completely changed my perception about the function of the Egyptian pyramids and pointed me toward the production of chemicals.
That's so interesting. I've never seen this before.
And this is... there's so many things to unpack about this particular site, but I'll mention two things. So the black basalt paving stones. Mm-hmm. So anytime you see black basalt, just remember heat storage.
Okay.
So once this material gets hot, it's interfacing with these electric fields that come from lightning strikes. And we'll get to how this occurs, how it's attracted, harnessed, and distributed through the pyramid systems here in just a little bit. But electric fields are going into this dielectric material.
Okay.
Dielectric materials are the most important thing about the ancient science, is understanding the properties of these stones as being functional components of the Egyptian pyramids. So the electric fields would course into this black basalt, heating up the material, and it would stay hot. Mm-hmm. The reason they implemented this black basalt was to prevent coagulation of the liquid solution that was flowing through this thing, and to maintain any suspended particles within the solution. So let's say you have a viscous chemical flowing through this conduit. Mm-hmm. If it gets cold, it could clog up the pipe.
Right.
So they implemented a material that could be utilized for heat storage applications, because once it got hot, it stayed hot, and it maintained the fluid flow through that channel into the collection bowl.
Got it.
And let's say you have valuable suspended particles in this solution.
And where's the solution coming from?
Right, so directly from the reaction chambers.
And where is the reaction chamber? This is inside of the pyramid?
Inside of the pyramid, yep.
Okay. How far away, roughly?
So the base and the inlet of this conduit is right up adjacent to the eastern side of the pyramid.
What's the distance, would you say?
I mean, 5 feet.
Oh, that close.
Yeah, so literally, so with this particular pyramid, the casing stones have all been removed off of the exterior. Mm-hmm. So the edge where the original casing stones would have been, mm-hmm. it's several feet back because you have the body of the core still intact, but the casing stones have been completely removed. So the distance between the core and the inlet of this conduit system is, 5 or 6 feet. But if the original casing stones were still in place, it would literally be adjacent to the side of the pyramid.
Okay. Wow.
So essentially, the conduit is running underneath this whole black basalt paving stone. Again, that black basalt, this is just showing dielectric constants, which mm-hmm. is a way to gauge the capacity of a material to store these electric fields. Mm-hmm. And all of these materials are dielectric materials with the capacity for storing electric fields. So I just wanted to show you that artifact. And this is basically the configuration of...
And this is Abusir we're talking about still.
Abusir, correct. Right. Yeah,
okay.
the configuration of the Pyramid of Nayusere.
Okay.
And you can see in red that is the path of this conduit system, and there's another one adjacent to it as well that also has a collection bowl, which I've never found that in person. This is from the 1900s from an archaeologist called Borchardt that did the original excavations of the pyramids of Abusir.
Okay.
I haven't ever found the second one, but it's on my list. Abusir is one of these sites that you need special permission access from the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities to go out and investigate the site, and we've been very fortunate. I always go to the sites on my tours, and I have a tour coming up in November where we also have special permission access to Abusir.
Remind me one more time the name of the pyramids at Abusir.
Yep. So there's the Pyramid of Neferkare,
Okay.
the Pyramid of Niuserre, and the Pyramid of Sahore. So there's 3 major pyramids out there. But Abusir is also adjacent to a site called Abu Gharaib that has those white calcite crystal bowls that have almost the gear-like configuration around the outside. And they also have some very interesting, and this is just an image of, the electric fields from lightning strikes permeating this dielectric material that cause it to get hot, maintaining the fluidity of the solution running through the conduit.
Okay, so at Abusir, what were the chemicals involved there? Or what were the chemicals being created with those 3 pyramids?
Yep, so Abusir is one of the sites where I have not developed a conclusive theory about which chemical was being produced inside of the chamber, mainly because I've never had access inside of the structure.
Okay.
So the interior chambers have completely collapsed, and they do not let people go inside of any of the 3 pyramids in Abusir. And for me, personally going inside of the pyramids is an essential part of developing a solid theory about how it operated. I can look at the configuration and you could study diagrams, but it's never sufficient to really help you understand what was going inside of these things. Because, for example, inside of the Red Pyramid, there's all sorts of staining that is indicative of fluid dynamics, right? Movement of gases and water throughout the structure. So there's actually staining all throughout the Red Pyramid that kind of shows you the fluid movement process of the chemical reactions that were occurring inside of the structure.
Okay, and the Red Pyramid you think was being used to create fertilizer?
Ammonia, correct. Now there's a whole bunch of other applications for ammonia. And it just so happens that there is metallurgy, right? So you can use it for mining and extraction of copper. And so again, this direction was never really my intention, but once I moved to Egypt, I really started to understand that this was a civilization that was predominantly involved with metallic ore mining and extraction and processing of different metals. So all of these chemicals are directly applicable to both metallurgy and mining.
Yes.
And that was a huge preoccupation of this civilization. And they've discovered in the chemical analysis of all the iron ore deposits on the Giza Plateau that this stuff is filled with incredibly valuable metal deposits, including gold and silver on the Giza Plateau, filled with deposits of gold. So they were using the chemicals specifically regarding the acidic solutions that were being produced on the Giza Plateau for leach mining of metals. And we kind of hinted at this last night about the civilization, this ancient mythology about a civilization that was preoccupied with gold mining here on this planet. And there's a ton of
you're talking about the Anunnaki mining for gold.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's if you believe Zechariah Sitchin.
Correct. Yes.
That's he's been widely contested with his translations of those Sumerian texts. A lot of people say that he was not a scholar, he was not a linguist, and a lot of linguists push back against what he's saying with saying that his translations are extremely inaccurate.
Yes,
not to say his stories aren't fantastic. I think the stories are fucking amazing.
Yeah.
I also agree with him on the pyramid. I don't know if I agree. I don't know what the pyramids are, but I certainly don't believe that the conventional theory that they were moved with pulleys is what happened. I don't understand how you can move 20-ton pieces of granite that high in the air and across 500 miles from the quarry. I don't know, but I wanted to put the context there that Zechariah Sitchin is, you got to take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and I 100% agree with that statement. I don't necessarily believe in that theory. It's just interesting that my research has pointed in a direction that there was a civilization here that constructed these pyramids, and they were utilizing these chemicals for mining applications. Now, this could even be applicable to the dynastic civilization, which we know was doing significant mining operations all across Egypt. And this is well documented in the archaeological record that the dynastic Egyptians were incredibly proficient at mining operations.
Have we ever found any evidence or remains of any sort of metal materials that they've fashioned? Any metal tool other than the copper chisels and stuff, the stone copper tools that they claim they use to create these perfectly symmetrical blocks?
Oh, yeah. So they've found iron implements all across Egypt, and they're actually in the Cairo Museum in a very obscure case. They have a whole case full of iron saws, different types of nails,
Really? Iron
hammers.
saws?
Correct.
Like
yeah.
you're talking about the long saws?
Saw blades, yeah.
Okay,
Big saw blades. And it's in the Cairo Museum. And it's a very obscure case that hardly anybody goes and looks at. But they do have some iron implements that they found in Egypt, saws, and all sorts of other stuff.
Do they think those saws are what cut the granite? This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Verso. Have you ever tried fasting or intermittent fasting? If so, you may be aware of the sizzling energy and mental clarity that you get if you do it long enough. The scientific data validating the health benefits from fasting for weight loss is overwhelming. But what doesn't get talked about enough is the longevity benefits you get from fasting. When you fast, your body turns on all its defense mechanisms to help your body hunker down to fight off illness and disease. But the problem is it takes 3 days of starving yourself to activate this process. Scientists like David Sinclair have recently discovered molecules to help your body turn on this process without having to fast. If you've ever heard this podcast before, you've heard me talk about Verso many times, and I've had world-renowned nutritional scientists like Dominic D'Agostino on the show, who is the guy who actually introduced me to Verso, and I've been taking it every day for the last 3 years. Cell Being is always the first thing I take in the morning after dragging my carcass into the kitchen, which wakes me up and gives me energy. I even use it for pre-workout. And Clean Being is the product I use every night before bed. After taking Clean Being for some time now, I have actually noticed a huge improvement in not only my hormone regulation, but my vision has improved. I know it sounds insane, but this stuff actually can improve your vision. My lipid regulation has gotten better. And another huge thing is all of a sudden, I don't get affected by all the pollen in the air. I don't have any of these reactions. And Clean Being has actually been scientifically proven to alleviate these things. Other clinical trials have proven healthier skin, less inflammation, healthier hair, lipid regulation, enhanced cognitive function, and improved metabolism. On top of that, Verso always publishes third-party testing on each batch produced to guarantee you're getting exactly what you pay for. So if you want to check out Verso and support this podcast at the same time, go to buy.ver.so/Danny and use the coupon code Danny at checkout for 15% off your first order. Again, that's buy.ver.so/DANNY and use the coupon code Danny for 50% off your first order. It's linked below. Now back to the show.
So we were talking about the metallic saw blades. So they've actually found remnants of not only the metal that was used in cutting these things. So, for example, the black basalt on the Giza plateau adjacent to the Great Pyramid. There are saw blade cuts all in this black basalt. And if you look down in there, you can see greenish material, which is copper oxide. Now, one of the big myths about the metal that was being utilized by the Egyptian civilization is that it was pure copper.
Right.
That is not correct. They've done a chemical analysis of the material that was found inside of these saw cuts, and it's something called arsenical copper. So it's an alloy of 90% copper and 10% arsenic, which completely changes the properties of the metal. It was not pure copper. It's arsenical copper or arsenical bronze, which was widely used in the ancient world. And this is the magic of alloys. If you combine metals, it can completely change the properties of the metal to make it much harder and much easier to cast. So they were using...
So you're talking about smelting them together?
Correct, yeah. Well, so one of the things about the copper ore deposits in Egypt, it's arsenical copper ore. So our arsenic and copper naturally occur in these metallic ore deposits. So it just so happens that the areas where they were mining this copper also have arsenical copper. So it's just a naturally occurring that these two metals kind of are found in conjunction with each other in nature. And again, yeah, ancient Egypt, arsenical, bronze, and copper. So again, that's a big myth about ancient Egypt, is that these things were pure copper. Right. If it was pure copper, it would not be utilized for a saw blade. It's not the right material. So I want to make sure, because they have done chemical analysis of this metal particles that were found in these saw blades. But in these cuts, they've also discovered particles of ilmenite and corundum, which are two naturally occurring minerals that are found in the black sand deposits in Egypt. This placer sand deposits all across the northern coast of Egypt.
Like the Nile Delta around there?
Yeah, so this is actually more along Alexandria and the Mediterranean coast. They have this stuff called the black sands.
Okay.
And this black sand deposits are abundant with heavy metal minerals that include both ilmenite and corundum. So ilmenite is a mineral that contains, right here.
Wow, look at that.
Yeah, the Egyptian black sand. So my book is called The Land of Chem, Chem, which is a play on words for the original name of Egypt, which is the Land of Chem, Khem.
That's the original name of Egypt?
Correct. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, so my book is The Land of Chemistry, Chem. But Khem is the etymology of our modern word for chemistry. So you have chem, you have alchemy, and now we have modern chemistry. So literally the original name for Egypt is the etymology and the genesis for our modern word for chemistry. Egypt was the birthplace of chemistry. Even according to conventional archaeology, they were the first civilization that ever manufactured synthetic compound, something called Egyptian blue, which is calcium copper silicate, which is a very sophisticated molecule that we still don't understand today, the manufacturing process that was utilized by the Egyptians to produce this blue paint.
We still don't know how they did it.
Still don't know.
Really?
Right. And
wow.
So the miraculous thing about Egyptian blue and the compound, so Egyptian blue, let's say it's just a paint, right? You find this paint over all of these temple walls covering the entire country of Egypt. So how many gallons of paint do you need to paint all of these temples? We're talking about hundreds of thousands of gallons of paint. This is indicative of an industrial scale chemical manufacturing process that had to be required to produce all of the paint for this industry. So it's a perfect example that
that's a ton of paint.
It's a ton of paint, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of gallons, and they've discovered that the chemical composition of all of the samples of Egyptian blue taken from all of these temples is incredibly consistent. And the compound has not changed over thousands of years. The molecule has not degraded, so it's an incredibly resilient chemical compound. They've also been testing Egyptian blue with modern day applications, and they've realized that it's a material for heat storage as well, and insulation, and it also emits photons. So when Egyptian blue absorbs light, it also emits light.
It says, what does that say at the end there? It says it was known to the Romans by the name Siriculum. After the Roman era, the Egyptian blue fell from use, and thereafter the manner of its creation was forgotten. In modern times, scientists have been able to analyze its chemistry and reconstruct how to make it. The ancient Egyptian word what does that say? Whiz? I don't know how to say that. It signifies blue, blue-green, and green. The first recorded use of Egyptian blue as the color name in English was in 1809. Calcium copper
tetrasilicate.
Tetrasilicate.
Calcium copper silicate. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a very sophisticated chemical compound. And they do have a general idea of how to produce this molecule, right, in a modern application. But they still don't understand exactly how the Egyptians were doing it.
Right.
Because they've never found the reactors that were utilized to produce this thing.
Yeah.
Right, so we can make it using modern applications, which give us an idea of how it was produced in the ancient time, but they still don't know exactly how they were manufacturing the compound.
Right. Are you aware of any sort of evidence of any sort of saw blades that can explain those cuts on those massive stones that Ben Kirkwick talks about? Like those massive circular saw cuts that are in those stones where it looks like they're using a fucking circular saw.
Yeah, tube drill. Yeah, tube drills. Yeah, so they've also taken chemical analysis from inside of these tube drills.
Like these?
Yeah, so you find these all over the Giza Plateau.
That bottom left one, Steve, that's a pretty good example.
Yeah, so that's on the Giza Plateau. Those are saw blade cuts that are in the Black Basalt Temple on the eastern floor of the Great Pyramid. And they found this I've seen it in person up close where you can see the remnants of this bluish green material down inside of these saw cuts. Yeah, so it's this arsenical copper or arsenical bronze with a mixture of the slurries. Now,
so this slurry you're talking about is something that was used to make it more abrasive, so those whatever saws they had could penetrate the stone far more easy.
Correct. And we still use this in modern stone cutting applications where you have the blade, but you're also pouring an abrasive slurry during the cutting process, which facilitates the removal of the material. And this is what we were talking about, how it's not necessarily the speed of the tool, but it's the feed rate. That it was possibly a very slow-moving saw, but they were removing a lot of material with each cut of the blade, which is indicative that they were using a slurry compound to facilitate the cutting process.
But what about the overcuts?
Yes.
Because it looks like, when you're using a saw and you're cutting something and you move too fast, you pull the saw up and then you correct yourself and then you go straight again. So if they were going slow, how would you explain the overcuts?
So I believe, again, I do agree with the idea that there were machines. It's not, two guys with a saw that are moving this thing back and forth, because if you had an error in the cutting process and it was just a hand operated two guys and a saw blade, if they messed up, you could stop very quickly the cutting process. But if you're using a machine apparatus, I could pull it up in the slides, but if you Google the Hierapolis saw, it's a perfect example of a saw cutting machine that was being utilized by the ancient Romans, and the Romans got everything they knew about cutting and moving stone from the dynastic Egyptians. Now, I don't think that the Egyptian pyramids are part of the dynastic civilization. I believe that they came around before that in a period known as the Saharan wet period, which is about 8500 BC to around 3500 BC, just before the beginning of the dynastic civilization.
So after the Younger Dryas.
Correct. Now, this is also a time period where the Sahara...
This is the saw you were talking about?
Correct, yeah. So basically, you have a water wheel powered saw that's connected to a series of gears. We were talking about gear ratios. So if you have a big gear and a small gear, the knowledge of gear ratio physics could very easily give you a very fast moving saw blade. And this was what was implemented by the Romans, where they have this wooden configuration, these huge saw blade systems. Now imagine this being set up at your quarry site, where you have a huge water wheel powered saw blade cutting system. And this is like, there's hundreds of these set up all over the quarry sites that are constantly just cutting stone, cutting stone, cutting stone.
And they're made of wood. And what do you think the saw is made out of?
Metal saw blades. So by the time they were probably still using arsenical copper during the time, but then this also sort of moves into the Iron Age a bit later on.
Okay, so they use these giant saws with some sort of slurry chemical compound that would help those things cut the stone, and they moved slow. But then how the hell do they get those fucking blocks up on top of that pyramid? How big are the blocks in the King's Chamber? Those pieces of granite?
So the blocks of the upper portions, they call them the relieving chambers inside the Great Pyramid of Giza. Those are very, very large. But one thing about the construction of the Egyptian pyramids, so for example, at the top of the pyramid, those are the smallest stones used in the construction. They put the biggest stones down at the bottom, and every successive layer of the Egyptian pyramids, the stones get smaller and smaller the higher you go up.
Right. But how big? So, Stephen, type in like the granite blocks inside the King's Chamber. And because there's like
they're huge.
There's levels of them, right?
Correct. Yes. Yeah. So I don't know the specific weight. I was going to say 65 tons. This thing here says 70 tons. But
so
those
70-ton granite blocks.
Those are incredibly large.
There you go. Yeah, click on that.
Yep.
Well, that's shitty. Maybe the next one? Maybe you can blow it up. So I want people to be able to see the, zoom in on that thing. So there's like, why the hell would they do that? Those massive 70-ton granite blocks with gaps in between them.
Yep.
With like a little TP roof on top. And that's pretty high up in the pyramid, right? The King's Chamber?
Correct. Yeah, it's about in the center of the structure. So it's not all the way at the top, but it is fairly high within the construction itself. And there is no good explanation. I don't really focus too much on the construction aspect because it's one of those mysteries where, I mean, you could really speculate all day about how they did it. There's a great researcher named Stephen Meyer that proposes that the pyramids were built using water apparatuses and that they were floated to the construction site using like wooden barges. And they recently published an article that corroborates that idea, where they found a system of channels leading up to the Giza Plateau.
Right.
And you can use water enclosures and a system of water locks
Right.
to move these stones up to the pyramid sites. And then let's say you establish your outer layer of casing stones first.
Yes.
You could then fill that area with water and use that to float the stones up to each other layer. So that's Stephen Meyer's idea. And it's a very interesting idea because I do believe that this civilization, they were masters of hydraulics, and they would have used water to their advantage in basically every application, whether it be construction of the pyramids or specifically regarding my research, water facilitates these chemical reactions, whether it's the mechanism of operation to push the chemicals through the system, also used as chemical reactants. Water is used inside the red pyramid. It's also used inside the Great Pyramid. Well, it's used inside all the pyramids, actually, in terms of the mechanism of operation that drives these things is water.
What do you think the reason that those granite blocks inside the king's chamber, the bottoms of them are like perfectly flat, right? And the tops are kind of like they're not perfect. They're kind of rough.
Yeah, so that's from the construction. So you see where the rough part is in the core and the flat part is laying on the level of stone below it. So they use that to make sure that it was level going all the way up with each level. You don't need the center piece because it was exposed to the inside of these relieving chambers. But on the edge of each one, they're flattened out. But in the center, they're completely rough.
Right.
So this was also a civilization that understood the mentality of work smarter and not harder.
So you think that rough part, it didn't matter.
It didn't matter, right? It was never going to be utilized. So I also believe that these structures are geometrically configured to amplify sound.
Oh yeah, I think it's like F sharp that resonates through that whole pyramid, right?
Correct.
The Great Pyramid.
Yeah. So like when you have the inside of a guitar or a violin, for example, it's very important to precisely tune the inside of that device because that's what causes the sound amplification.
Right.
So the geometry of the inside of these chambers was very, very important. And the finishing of the inside, for example, when we talk about the Serapeum in Saqqara, these huge containers inside the Serapeum that mostly are not finished on the outside, but they were very, very intent about finishing the inside of these containers. So there was something about the acoustic properties of the inside of the container for amplification that wasn't necessary to finish the outside. So that's why I do believe that the bottoms are flat, was just to ensure that each level went up correctly, but then the rest of it wasn't necessary to flatten everything out.
Okay. Should we talk about the Great Pyramid and talk about what your theory is on how it works and show the schematics and all that?
Yeah, so let's kind of go back in time a little bit because I want to go back to the Red Pyramid and kind of explain the mechanisms of operation that went into the Red Pyramid. Okay. And then I want to go through all of the structures.
You think the Red Pyramid was somehow connected to the main pyramids on the Giza Plateau or no? Was it completely separate?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So yes, I do believe that all of the structures on the western bank of the Nile River are an interconnected system. It's a huge network of temples and pyramids that were all functional structures. However, the specific chemicals that were being manufactured are somewhat independent. Okay. That being said, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that says that there's underground shaft systems that connect all of these pyramids in sequence. So Yusuf Awiyan's father, for example, has reported that as kids, they used to run through these underground shafts that connected, and they used to be able to go from one pyramid site to the next pyramid site to the next pyramid. So I do believe that these things are interconnected. We just don't have any archaeological evidence to substantiate that at this point. I have had an experience we were talking about last night, how the lead inspector of the Giza Plateau escorted one of my tour groups, and he kept saying over and over that they know for sure that there's tunnels that connect the Great Pyramid into the Sphinx enclosure, which is something that the conventional dynastic pharaoh burial theory, it doesn't corroborate that, and these two things don't work in conjunction, because why would you have underground tunnel systems connecting the burial of Khufu into a structure that was supposedly built by Khafra, which came around later? Again, this is the conventional succession of the building was Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaura built these three pyramids on the Giza Plateau. I believe they were all built at the same time. and that all of the major Egyptian pyramids were built in a relatively similar time period as connected chemical manufacturing plants.
How long do you think it took them to build those pyramids?
Oh, it's impossible to say. You know, they say that conventionally...
Wild guess.
Wild guess. I mean, it depends on the sophistication of the civilization that was building them. Mm-hmm. So whatever they were doing to build these things, it was easy for them.
Yes,
because you look at the execution of the construction and the amount of times that they replicated this perfection, the alignments, the measurements, the geometry, all of the sciences that go into designing and executing these things. They clearly had the knowledge to do it. They had the capability to do it. They could do it over and over and over again and continue to replicate the results. That being said, there are some examples of pyramids that failed. For example, the Pyramid of Maidum out in the Lahoun Oasis, which I believe was a test structure to implement the physics and chemistry that would later be used in the Red Pyramid, but this thing experienced a catastrophic collapse and the whole outside of the pyramid collapsed. So they never activated the structure because there were design flaws within the structure. So there are some indications that they did test these things. Sometimes it didn't work out. And there's also an indication of evolution in these designs. Yeah, the Pyramid of Maidum.
That's the one that collapsed?
Yep. So that used to be a completely tetrahedral pyramid with casing stones, and it was a perfect pyramid shape. But all of the casing stones collapsed on the outside.
Do you think... I mean, it's pretty big, but I was wondering.
It's huge.
I was wondering maybe it could have been like later civilizations trying to copycat, but
right. No, this thing is
still pretty incredible.
Oh, it's one of the most impressive pyramids. When you go out there, I mean, you're staring up into the sky at this towering core. This step. Look at how small the people are.
Oh my God, yeah, that's huge.
Oh, it's unbelievable, and it's one of the most. So that pyramid is attributed to the pharaoh Seneferu.
Oh, okay.
Which they said that he built the Pyramid of Maidum, the Bent Pyramid, and the Red Pyramid. So 3 massive pyramid structures are attributed to the same pharaoh within his lifetime.
Wow.
That's the conventional story, is that he built all of these things.
Okay.
He started with the Pyramid of Maidum. There was catastrophic collapse of the structure. So then he moved to Dashur and built the Bent Pyramid, right? This thing that has...
Right. It's like starts out kind of wide, then it goes in more.
Absolutely immaculate construction, and it's still one of the only pyramids that has the casing stones intact. And you can walk up to the corner of this thing, and it's like a razor blade down the side of this thing. You could take a piece of paper and just slice it down. It's so sharp.
This one?
Yep, correct. And if you go to the northeastern corner, the casing stones are still completely intact on the northeastern corner, and it's just immaculate. It's an unbelievable sight up in person, and it's one of my favorite views in Egypt.
Do you think the shape of this thing is intentional?
100%.
Is it the only one that looks like that?
Yes.
Okay.
So I believe there's communication encoded in the design of the Egyptian pyramids. And if you take the tapered top of the Bent Pyramid, it is the exact same geometry of the Red Pyramid, which is adjacent to the structure. So they took the ammonia solution that was being manufactured inside of the Red Pyramid, transported it underground in a shaft system into the Bent Pyramid, where they were converting that aqueous ammonia into solid ammonium bicarbonate, right? If you want a fertilizer, it's much more effective to have it as a solid compound so you can take it out to the farms and easily distribute it. It's a lot easier to move solid compounds than it is to move liquids.
Right.
And this is what we do today. We convert aqueous ammonia solution into solid fertilizer. So that was the configuration of these 2 structures. Yeah, that's the northeastern corner of the Bent Pyramid. It's absolutely
that's incredible.
It's spectacular to see it in person. It's really wild. So I believe this is 100% intentional to indicate that there is a connection in the function of the Red Pyramid and the Bent Pyramid, because you take the Red Pyramid and you can sit it right on top of the Bent Pyramid, which is an indication that you were taking aqueous chemical number 1, you were transporting it over here and converting it into the secondary chemical that was being manufactured in Dashur.
Okay. Now, Egypt was green when you imagine that these were built, right?
Correct, yeah. So that takes us back to the time period of their construction and operation, which is a time period known as the Saharan Wet Period. And there was prolific rainfall in the upper eastern Sahara during this time period. and we see the agricultural areas that were located along the Nile River moving out into the upper eastern Sahara. And I believe that the terraforming applications, so not only creating thunderstorms, but also use fertilizers to go out and transform the desert into an agriculturally rich farmland. So this is the secondary application for the Egyptian pyramids and the ancient structures in Ireland, these stone circle systems, and the White Horse Hills of Wiltshire, England. So we recently had a research expedition to England and Ireland, and we were exploring these White Horse Hills that all have standing stones at the top of these hills. And there's two sloping sides. We'll get to it here in just a minute on these hills. And they're inscribed with a white horse. Now, the white horse is relatively modern, but if you look at the symbolism of the white horse, it is an ancient symbol for thunderstorms and lightning. In all of these ancient religions and mythologies, the white horse symbol has existed to indicate cumulonimbus clouds and lightning gods.
Okay.
So there is a direct secret in plain sight emblazoned on the White Horse Hills of Wiltshire, England, indicating that these hills were used to generate thunderstorms. And I'll get to exactly how that was happening here in just a minute.
Okay.
But that led me to the final conclusion about the operation of the Egyptian pyramids, which were also to produce thunderstorms, which is a direct connection to what Randall Carlson is working on with the modern thunderstorm generator.
Okay.
And
I can't wait to see how this is
all
all connected.
yeah. Oh, dude, it's all going to wrap up together. And it's again, I never intended to stumble across all of these discoveries, but it's one of those things that once you start pulling the thread, the whole thing starts to unravel. And when you look at it from the perspective of physics and chemistry, everything really starts to make sense in terms of the configuration of the chambers.
Okay, so you came up with this hypothesis about how these pyramids were chemical processing plants and why they produced chemicals. You assume it's for fertilizer.
One application, yes.
One of the applications for fertilizer. How did you become aware of the hills in England that you claim are built to or are there to generate thunderstorms or cumulonimbus clouds?
Yeah.
How did you discover this?
So the universe works in mysterious ways, and there's been some synchronicities along my journey that I never could have anticipated. So we went to England. I was going to propose to my wife, Alexa, at Stonehenge. So I went there this was the whole impetus of our trip to England and Ireland was A for the proposal. We were going to go to Stonehenge and drive around that area so that we could investigate the ancient structures around Stonehenge. And then we were going to go to Ireland so that I could finally document all of the structures, for example, Newgrange and all of these other passage chamber structures that are directly already included in my first book in terms of the production of a chemical called ferrous sulfate. And we'll get to that here in a minute.
Okay.
But the White Horse Hills were kind of an unexpected discovery where, we're driving around and looking on Google Maps for ancient sites, and we just happened to see this structure called the Cheryl Obelisk.
Okay.
So this guy built an obelisk on top of one of these White Horse Hills in the place where the standing stone once originally was erected. So I had to see this thing in person, an obelisk on top of one of these hills in England, because I knew that there was a connection again to ancient Egypt.
Right.
And
this obelisk was built, like the 1800s or something?
Correct. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. You can Google Cheryl Obelisk. I don't know the specific dates of when it was erected, but it's a relatively modern addition to the site. But they say that it's hollow, and it was built upon the place where the standing stone originally stood on top of this hill. So these things were designed to give lightning the shortest path to ground.
Okay.
It is the highest point of elevation anywhere on the landscape, and you have this huge standing stone which would have acted like a lightning rod. And all of these structures are built on chalk bedrock.
Okay.
It's Cherril, Cherril.
ERR.
Yep, the Cherril Obelisk.
First try.
Yeah.
Look at that one next to that on the right. It's pretty cool. Yeah.
No, that's it. That's the same thing. And it's this huge obelisk on this hill. And again, you're standing up there, and it is by far the highest point on the landscape.
So you saw this, and what made you think thunderstorms?
So when I first went to Egypt in 2017.
Getting into credit card debt is easy. Getting out, well, the system is set up so we don't. If you're struggling with credit cards, medical bills, personal loans, or collections, you need to check out PDS Debt. PDS Debt can roll all of your bills into one low monthly payment. If you're making monthly payments on your debt and your balance isn't going down, this program is for you. Everyone with $10,000 or more in eligible debt qualifies, and there's no minimum credit score required. Save thousands in interest and fees and pay off your debt in a fraction of the time. PDS Debt is a top-rated company on Google and has an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. PDS Debt actually cares about getting you out of debt. All you got to do is go read their reviews and see how many of their employees have been mentioned by name. Get a free debt analysis right now by going to pdsdebt.com/Danny. It only takes 30 seconds. That's pdsdebt.com/DANNY. pdsdebt.com/Danny to get your free debt analysis. It's linked below. Now back to the show.
I had this intuition that the Great Pyramid specifically was being struck by lightning. And now we have evidence from these chemical analysis of samples from the Giza plateau that proves that there were lightning strikes on the plateau. They found these silicate microspherules from fulgurites. So fulgurites are essentially fossilized lightning. So when lightning strikes sand, for example, it'll fuse all of this sand together and it produces silicate microspherules.
Right.
In some of the chemical analysis that was taken by the Abusir project, they found these silicate microspherules from fulgurites, which is direct evidence that the area around the Great Pyramid was being struck by lightning. They found these next to a structure called the Trial Passages, which is on the northeastern corner of the Great Pyramid. So I had this intuition back in 2017, and I always knew that lightning was the power source of the Egyptian pyramids, because you have to have a power source to drive all these chemical reactions. And I truly believe that the Egyptian pyramids and all of these ancient structures across the planet were designed to work in conjunction with the forces of nature. They were harnessing these naturally occurring phenomenon like the telluric currents flowing through the surface of the earth, which is something that was Nikola Tesla was huge into researching telluric currents because they're extremely important in the function of our planet. Storm systems, telluric currents are directly connected to lightning strike locations. And I believe Tesla was on this.
And earthquakes.
Correct. Yeah, they're all connected. So I'm a huge proponent of the electric universe theory, and that our entire solar system is a huge electromagnetic system. So everything that's happening on the sun, the moon, the planets, and the earth are all this interconnected electrical system. And I believe this is knowledge that was possessed by this ancient civilization that we still fully don't understand, the mechanisms of operation that go into how our planet work. And I believe this ancient civilization knew this, which is why when you see the medieval alchemists, they always did all of their chemical reactions and sacred rituals in conjunction with the movement of the planet and the stars, because they understood that there were specific events and electromagnetic phenomenon that occurred during these conjunctions and solar alignments and lunar alignments and planetary conjunctions and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
Same reason why the Egyptian pyramids are also aligned to these same phenomenon.
So, okay. You had an intuition where you saw the pyramids and you just thought lightning. You just thought this has to have something to do with lightning.
Yeah, I remember I was sitting at the Mina house and I was smoking a cigar and sitting there eating dinner, and I was looking up at these things and I was like, man, if there was any sort of electrical storm, this is by far the tallest structure on the landscape. And lightning is always going to seek the shortest path to ground in an area where there's a differential in the charges, right? So lightning occurs because there's negative charges in the atmosphere, positive charges on the ground. That causes the electrostatic discharge of lightning.
Does lightning still strike the Great Pyramid a lot today?
I've heard anecdotally that people have said that they have seen it, but there's also not a lot of thunderstorms anymore. This goes back to the time period of operation during the Saharan wet period where the pyramids were actually operational. And the operation of the Egyptian pyramids was directly related to the terraforming of the Eastern Sahara. I believe that the Saharan wet period is a direct result of the terraforming applications of the Egyptian pyramids, and that these things were built to create this transformation of the landscape, to bring the rainstorms to the area. They were producing chemicals to fertilize all of this sand and turn it into rich agricultural farmland. So they are infrastructure constructions, right? So one of the things is, what is the reason for building these huge monuments?
And why do they have to be so perfect too? Because they're chemical plants. How do you explain the precision? Do they need that precision? Those like perfectly square structure, like the circumference of the pyramid, or when you measure like the angles, like all the angles are perfect, and the slopes are exactly the same.
Yeah. So we go into precision tolerance machining these days, right? And the more precise your machine is, the better it operates.
Yes.
And these things were designed to harness these electric fields, the telluric currents flowing through the earth, also these specific alignments of the planets, the sun and the moon. So the more specific the alignments, the more precise the device, the more effective the production of the machine.
Okay. Yeah, I don't understand the reason for, like, because if you're saying that the precision has to do with the electromagnetic currents flowing through the rocks mixing with the chemicals.
So we'll get into exactly how that operates here in just a second.
Okay.
So let me go back so we can kind of establish the timeline and the sequence of manufacturing.
Okay.
So it all started for me with the red pyramid, but it all goes back to the step pyramid, which conventionally, according to the timeline of construction of the Egyptian pyramids, this was the first structure that was built. And I've proposed two different hypotheses about the function of the step pyramid that are related to the production of methane gas.
Okay.
The first being one that is very compatible with the dynastic Egyptian civilization, which is utilizing cattle manure as a catalyst for biogas fermentation or anaerobic digestion. And the configuration of the step pyramid is very indicative of a modern anaerobic digester. So it has a northern inlet shaft, it has a southern outlet shaft, and then it has a central rectangular reaction chamber. There's also a huge storage silo that was constructed on the western side of the step pyramid that, even according to the conventional archaeology, was used for the storage of agricultural material. So what we do today is you create a slurry using water, agricultural scraps, and cattle manure. You introduce it into your anaerobic digestion chamber, and it produces methane gas.
So you put it into those those things on the outside?
So the central chamber, I don't know if I have a pointer here, but the central rectangular chamber would have been your reaction chamber. There's a sloping inlet shaft.
So what I was asking, like,
Yes.
so the bottom right diagram.
Yes.
That's where you have that pot where the slurry and the gas mix together, right?
Correct, yeah.
So those two little mixing pits on the outside,
Yep.
there's one mixing pit.
Yes.
What was put into that mixing pit?
Correct. So on the left diagram, you see there at B, there is a literal inlet mixing pit on the northern side of the step pyramid that was used to introduce the slurry into the reaction chamber. So it's a slurry of water, agricultural material, and cattle manure that was introduced into the central chamber. The reaction occurs due to anaerobic digestion that is catalyzed by bacteria in the cattle manure, and the methane gas rises up out of the structure and is collected through an outlet pipe.
And the gas goes into the gas holder.
Correct. And the step pyramid has the exact same configuration.
Okay.
Now, one important thing to remember about the evolution in the construction of the step pyramid is that it was not originally a pyramid shape. It was originally a single-level mastaba platform. And this is how the development of pyramid building in Egypt began. So let's say that this thing is a methane production plant. You don't want your methane leaking out into the atmosphere, and you want to be able to encapsulate the pressure inside of the reaction chamber. So you start off with a mastaba platform, and as the production volume increases, they began to build other layers on top of that mastaba to encapsulate the pressure and to prevent any environmental contamination of methane gas leaking out into the atmosphere.
Okay.
So they added pyramid number 1 here on the left. The volume continues to increase, and now you add pyramid number 2.
Okay.
So this is the evolution of pyramid building, which is the genesis for the tetrahedral structure that we see later at the red pyramid, which is the next pyramid in the sequence. It is the ideal configuration for maintaining the stability of the internal reaction chambers. Because when we get to the configuration of the red pyramid, you'll see that these chambers are not standalone chambers. You have to have these chambers encased in a body of stone. For example, the inlet shaft, you can't just have that hanging out in the air.
Right.
You have to have a body of stone surrounding that thing to support the internal reaction chambers. It's also to encapsulate the pressure and ensure the stability of the internal reaction chambers during the reaction process, because there was a lot of heat and a lot of pressure generated. So by having this pyramid shape, you're literally encasing the entire thing in a solid body of stone.
Okay.
So the genesis of pyramid building started at the step pyramid of Saqqara.
And the step pyramid is not necessarily like perfect.
Correct. It's not at all.
Okay.
And in my opinion, it didn't necessarily need to be, because it was never really, the single level mastaba platform would have been sufficient for the chemical reactions that were occurring inside of the structure.
Got it.
So do we know that it has I didn't know that there was a pyramid inside of that pyramid.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, that's been conclusively proven. And they've actually found that other pyramid sites, for example, the pyramid of Menkaura, which is the third pyramid on the Giza plateau, also has a finished smaller pyramid inside of it. And the entire pyramid was later expanded, leaving the pyramid structure that you can see today. So there's several structures that are indicative that it was originally a smaller structure inside of it, and the entire thing was later expanded.
Wow.
So, like I was saying, with the compatibility of this original hypothesis about the function of the step pyramid with the dynastic Egyptian civilization. So I believe that a lot of the symbols and the hieroglyphs from the dynastic Egyptian civilization encode information about chemistry. They're esoteric symbols where they have multiple layers of interpretation depending on your initiation level. Right? So the more you understand the symbols, they encode information about chemistry. So for example, the scarab beetle. The scarab is a dung-collecting beetle that, according to the conventional religious interpretation, represents the god Khepri, the rising and setting sun, and the process of resurrection. To me, this symbol, a dung-rolling beetle, was never really indicative of something like the glorious rising sun. I never understood that connection. But if you look at it from the basic mechanism of operation, a dung beetle collects dung. And that's literally the first step in the chemical manufacturing process for producing methane using anaerobic digestion, is collecting the cattle dung, because that's literally the catalyst that's generating the methane gas.
Right.
So I believe that the symbol of the scarab esoterically encodes information about methane gas production. Same thing with the deification of cattle, right? Cattle were extremely important to all of these ancient civilizations. Well, if you were harvesting the cattle dung from these sacred cows to produce this miraculous chemical, methane, which is an incredibly powerful fuel source. We use it for all sorts of domestic applications, heating, lighting. You can also use it for metallurgy. High temperature methane flames could have been used for smelting applications. And then methane is one of the most important synthesis gases that we use in our modern chemical manufacturing applications. It's used as a syngas to create hydrogen, which is directly related to the function of the red pyramid, where they were breaking down methane gas, first converting it into hydrogen, and then converting it into ammonia. So that's my first hypothesis about the function of the step pyramid.
Okay.
But you also see all of these underground tunnels below the step pyramid. So I did a two-step analysis of this structure, and I proposed a hypothesis with the original configuration being the northern inlet shaft and the southern outlet shaft. And I also have a secondary hypothesis. So the bedrock inside of the step pyramid is basically completely black. And it is very indicative of bedrock that has decayed organic material that is associated with natural gas deposits, natural gas being methane. And this is one of the ways that we identify methane seeps and methane deposits today, is by this agricultural material containing bedrock. And the bedrock below the step pyramid looks completely different than all the rest of the bedrock in the local area. So there was something very specific about the selection for the location of the step pyramid. And I believe that they could have been tapping into these naturally occurring methane deposits below the step pyramid. This is now pushing the timeline back. and taking the function of the Egyptian pyramids further away from something that was compatible with the dynastic civilization and pushing it a little bit farther back to this civilization that had profound knowledge of geological deposits, not only of things like natural gas, but also metallic ore deposits, and extremely proficient at mining and extracting applications. So I believe that these could be methane mining tunnels, and this entire system was filled with water to extract methane gas out of the bedrock.
Whoa.
And I have a new episode. This is episode 94, which is a bit further back. And I just did an updated episode where I have an active diagram that shows exactly how these 11 shafts work as pumps to increase and then reduce the pressure within the system using hydraulics to release methane gas from these underground deposits.
And then so after this pyramid created the methane gas, where did they collect it, and where did they bring it somewhere else?
Yeah, so the step pyramid actually has these things that they call dummy chapels. So it's a huge 40-acre complex that has literal storage containers on site that conventional archaeology calls dummy chapels. But they literally have storage containers on site that could have been used for methane storage. Wow. And I also believe that the majority of this methane was distributed for other industrial applications. So directly to the Red Pyramid, for example. And you can see, so here's that really, really dark colored bedrock inside of the step pyramid. And this looks completely different than all of the other bedrock in the surrounding area.
This is the pyramid that we were just talking about.
Yeah, this is the inside of the central reaction chamber inside of the step pyramid.
Wow.
Yep.
It's huge.
Oh, it's an immense structure. You can never really get the sense of how big these things are until you step inside it and you're like, oh my God, I had no idea the scale of this operation. And the tunnels below the step pyramid, there's 3 kilometers worth of tunnels below the step pyramid. And this is where they found all of these vases.
Oh, really?
There was, underneath the step pyramid is where they found all of these artifacts, which according to the conventional story
they were to put down there after.
Correct, by the pharaoh Djoser.
Okay.
So one of the interesting stories is that, so this was supposed to be the burial for the pharaoh Djoser. Djoser's burial was never found inside of this structure, but they have found other burial artifacts inside of the step pyramid. One of them being the body of a woman that was carbon dated to 500 years before the reign of the pharaoh Djoser.
So why do they connect Djoser to him?
Right, exactly. They also found a mummified foot inside of this structure, which they thought was the foot of the pharaoh Djoser, but it was later carbon dated to the Ptolemaic area, which was much, much later in the dynastic Egyptian timeline during the Egyptian Greek period. So neither one of these burial artifacts are the pharaoh Djoser, yet they still attribute this entire structure to a pharaonic burial, even though there's never been one found.
That's so bizarre, man.
So they have found some intrusive burials. For example, inside the Pyramid of Menkaure, they also found a wooden sarcophagus in the upper chamber that had the cartouche of Menkaure written on it, but it was the body of a young woman. So not the pharaoh either.
Right.
So they have found some burials in some of these pyramids, but it's later been proven to not be the pharaoh that they thought it was.
Yeah, I don't think many people will dispute, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, that these things were not burial tombs. I think most people know that with the access to the internet these days, that there's an enormous, overwhelming amount of evidence to prove that otherwise.
Right. And in my opinion, all of the pharaonic burials are in the Valley of the Kings. They're also doing a new project within the Ministry of Antiquities in Egypt called the Search for Khufu on the Giza Plateau, which was a new investigation to try and find the burial of Khufu. And they have an idea of where it could possibly be on the eastern side of the Great Pyramid in this sort of burial temple complex that was later added. Even according to the conventional timeline, it's not 4th dynasty. It's much later on. They added this burial funerary complex on the eastern side of the Great Pyramid. So that's where they're looking for the burial of Khufu.
I thought they already thought the burial of Khufu was the Great Pyramid.
Well, that's the exact point, is that by doing this new project called the Search for Khufu, they're admitting that they know that the Great Pyramid was never intended for the burial of Khufu.
So like they're admitting it without actually admitting it.
Correct. Yeah. So now we're going to search in this new location to try to find the actual burial. But all this whole time they've been saying, but the Great Pyramid was supposed to be the burial. So they're finally sort of some discoveries coming to light that these things were never actually intended for pharaonic burial. They certainly could have been repurposed during the dynastic period for ritualistic purposes. I've heard a lot of theories about the Great Pyramid being a temple of initiation, which it certainly could have been for later esoteric societies that came around to repurpose these things. But all of these esoteric societies also have knowledge of chemistry. So if you're going through an initiation and being introduced into the mysteries of the most important ancient science on the planet, alchemy or chemistry, our modern world, everything we have and look around us is because of chemistry.
It's bizarre. It's wild to think about. Like, if these pyramids are like, if the Great Pyramid's, let's just say 50,000 years old,
right?
How many fucking people have been inside that thing?
Correct.
From so many different civilizations, from so many different epochs of of our history, of our timeline. Like, it's probably the one of few structures that millions and millions and millions of people from every single generation have wandered through and explored and destroyed in the process.
Still to this day.
And it's still standing.
And that's one of the most difficult things to try to unravel when assessing the construction up there, is because there's so many different layers of repurposing of these sites. So you had reconstruction during the dynastic period, and then you had the Greek pyramid and the Roman occupation, and all of the ancient civilizations have either come around and removed stone from the sites, or they've added extra stuff in terms of temples or whatever else. So there's been all sorts of repurposing of these monuments that make it even more difficult to understand. It also appears that there were definitely components that have been removed from inside of these structures. For example, there's some housings in the second chamber of the Red Pyramid, which I call the secondary air reformer. And you can see where chisel marks have scooped something out of these housings. Also inside of the Great Pyramid, it certainly appears that there have been components that were removed from inside of the Grand Gallery.
Yes.
So there's things that have been taken out of these structures that we'll never know. There's no way to ever prove what it was. I mean, we can certainly speculate about what these things were. For example, inside of the Red Pyramid, I think there may have been a heat exchange mechanism that was installed in the upper part of the secondary air reformer.
Can you show, there's this is what it was, yeah.
Yeah. So this is basically a diagram showing our modern day process for the industrial scale production of ammonia, something called the Haber process. And I'll get into Fritz Haber and his connection to Egypt here in just a second, because there is an almost identical comparison to the first modern industrial reactor that was used to produce ammonia and the configuration of the Red Pyramid. And I found in my research that Fritz Haber, one of his favorite vacation destinations was Egypt.
Perfect.
And he was traveling back and forth to Egypt. Fritz Haber was a Nazi scientist.
Really?
Correct, yeah. So he was going back and forth to Egypt, and I believe that he may have stumbled across the same information that I've extrapolated by trying to reverse engineer the Red Pyramid, and he created the first apparatus to manufacture ammonia during the modern day.
Was he one of the paperclip scientists that we got?
No, so he actually
was that way?
He committed suicide because they ended up using ammonia for
kill people?
To kill people, yeah. They used it for explosives and they used it for toxic compounds when he never designed it for that application. There was also some stuff with his wife, and the story of Fritz Haber is very tragic. But anyway, he was a chemist that was very, very interested in Egypt, and I'll show you here in just a second the configuration of the modern apparatus compared to the Red Pyramid.
Maybe he wanted to make some smelling salts.
Exactly. I mean, that's an ammonia-based compound.
Right.
It's like ammonium.
Here. Get you some.
Ammonium AD.
Whew.
No, so I think this is ammonium chloride, the smelling salt compound. But you can also make explosives using ammonia.
Oh, right.
So before I get to ammonia, so that Rogan clip,
the ammonia sacrament,
where they're listening to that blade, the the Blood Rave song from Rave, and it's Joey Diaz and Brendan Shaw.
Oh, where he's dancing, sniffing it.
It's so funny.
There's so many good memes of that.
Whew. But that's exactly what the final chamber of the Red Pyramid smells like.
Smells like this in the very top chamber.
Correct. Pure chemical ammonia. Man, that stuff hits hard. I don't see how you could take that
This
deep
is
of
an
a
old
breath
one
of it.
too.
Oh, yeah,
The
yeah.
new
I can
ones-
imagine
the
it's
new
much
ones will
stronger.
ruin your day.
Yeah. So, ammonia, the word for ammonia, the etymology of the word ammonia traces directly back to the god Ammon. Ammon and ammonia. The god Ammon from ancient Egypt is the deity of fertility. He is literally a god that is an ancient esoteric symbol for fertilizer. He has crops growing out of his head. He has these two huge sheaves of wheat growing out of the crown to symbolize growth of crops and fertility.
Wow.
And Ammon is where we get our modern word for ammonia. So there's all sorts of esoteric information encoded in the hieroglyphs, deities, etc. of dynastic Egyptian pyramid that point back to a lineage, pre-existing lineage, that had extensive knowledge of chemistry. So this is our modern process for manufacturing ammonia, where you see there on the top left, they take methane, react it with water, and the final synthesis happens in the last chamber where you're introducing nitrogen from the air. So I'll walk through this process. This diagram is a little bit more complicated than what we have in the Red Pyramid, but let's focus on, all right, so this is the inside of the Red Pyramid.
This looks like the Grand Gallery, doesn't it?
It's very similar to the configuration in terms of the tiered upper vault, correct?
Okay.
Yeah. But you can see here on the left, the profuse staining coming out of the stone inside of this chamber. And the explanation for this is bats. Look on the right. This is an image from one of the original not excavations, but modern like cleaning process and renovations inside of the structure. And this is before they installed the wooden floors. There's now wooden floors that cover up all the stone. And you see how dense and intense the staining is on the southern wall of this chamber. So again, they say that this staining is from bats.
Particularly at the bottom of it.
Correct. Yeah. And you can see here on the left that there is a fluid dynamic pattern that leads from the top of the vault down in through the connecting chamber.
Yep.
The connecting passage.
They couldn't clean that off no matter how hard they tried.
Well, they've actually tried, and it's
That's
the,
so fucked.
the lower part is much cleaner today, but you can still see it when you go inside there. And you can see on the bottom left corner of the chamber that looks like a wave crashing up into that.
Yep.
So we actually did an experiment where we took a rectangular container with the exact same dimensions and configuration of the Red Pyramid, and we introduced water through the proposed inlet shaft, and it creates that exact same wave pattern. As the water is flowing into the lower part of the chamber, it crashes into that back left corner, and then it wraps around the lower part of the chamber, filling up the first chamber of the Red Pyramid.
Okay.
But all of these are extrusions. And the chemical analysis of these extrusions has shown that it's calcium carbonate from the limestone. There's also iron oxide, strontium oxide. There's zinc in there. There's thorium in there. And I have a 3-part series that discusses the full chemical analysis of this material.
So they're seeping from the stone?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. And you can literally see inside of the chamber like the drips coming out of the stone. But the conventional explanation is that it's from bats.
Okay.
First of all, when bats, drop guano, they do it when they're flying through the air and it drops down onto the ground. They don't have a coordinated strategy to all pee up against the walls. That's just not how it works. And there's some very specific delineation of lines of this staining that are directly related to pressure fluctuations at these specific levels within the tiers. But here on the left is the modern apparatus created by Fritz Haber to produce ammonia. And you can see that there's an inlet tube going into the first chamber. The first chamber is connected into the second one. And then you have a third larger chamber that's elevated above the other two. Then on the right, you have the configuration of the Red Pyramid of Dashur, which has that exact same configuration. You have an inlet shaft. You have reactor number 1 connected into reactor number 2. And the third and final synthesis chamber is elevated above the 3.
And this whole thing is to create ammonia.
Correct.
And the ammonia, I'm guessing, is in it's in the very, very top part of the top chamber.
Correct. Yeah.
And then how do they get the ammonia out?
Yeah. So there's a huge pit in this final chamber, and there's a lot of indications that there was an outlet shaft running out of this final synthesis chamber, because they went through a lot of effort to remove all of the stone from inside of this chamber. So I believe that there was a shaft leading out of the bottom of this thing that was the original outlet shaft that was used to extract the aqueous ammonia. Now, when I say aqueous, I mean a liquid solution. Well, let me clarify. There's a big difference between liquid ammonia and an ammonia solution. Liquid ammonia is ammonia cooled down to a very, very cold temperature when it transforms from a gas into a liquid. They didn't have that capability within this structure. But when you dissolve ammonia gas into water, you create an aqueous solution of ammonia, which is what I was proposing was happening inside of this thing.
Okay.
So to give you a quick rundown of how this works, right? So you fill these chambers, the lower chambers, with water. The first step is to fill above the connecting shaft. When you fill up to the level of the connecting shaft, you create an isolated reaction chamber in the primary chamber, because there's nothing that can go in or out if you have water filling that connecting shaft. That also sets the primary pressure conditions inside of the chamber. And this is the step-by-step process that I went through in evaluating the configuration of the red pyramid, because as you go to the top of the chamber, the volume of the chamber decreases.
As you go up.
Correct.
Okay.
That's the reason for the tiered vault configuration, is as the water level rises inside of the chamber, it is pushing gas up into that converging vault, reducing the volume and increasing the temperature and pressure. When you take a gas that has volume of 1 and you squeeze it into volume of 0.5, you've doubled the temperature and pressure.
Right.
So that was the basic mechanism of operation that was involved in the chemical reaction process inside of the red pyramid. They were also using electric field chemistry and oriented electric fields to drive these chemical reactions, but that's a bit further down the line in the explanation. It's more complicated than I put out in the first book in the series. Is called The Land of Chem, an initiation into ancient chemistry through the degrees of the Egyptian pyramids. And each chapter is a degree of initiation where the operation of each structure is explained. So the first chapter is the step pyramid. The next chapter is the red pyramid. Next chapter is the bent pyramid. It goes in sequence explaining how all of these things work.
Right.
So the first reaction is to transform the methane from the step pyramid to liberate that hydrogen, right? Because it has 4 hydrogens in that molecule. Primary steam reforming. So we have an abundant source of hydrogen, and then we can also convert that hydrogen into ammonia in this 3-stage chemical reaction sequence. So you raise the water level, you've increased your temperature and pressure. There's a reaction between the steam from the water and the methane that creates hydrogen and carbon monoxide. You then lower the water level to create an aperture, an opening between the first chamber and the second chamber, and these high pressure gases will flow into the second chamber. There's also a drain. See here on the diagram that there's a hole in the floor up against the southern wall of the second chamber.
Where?
So on the right is the north, on the left is the south. And if you look at the diagram, the southern wall of the second chamber, there's actually a hole in the floor there.
Okay.
I believe that was the water drain that was used to lower the water. So the inlet is coming from the opening in the northern shaft. Mm-hmm. There's also a pit at the bottom of the northern shaft that was used as the inlet to fill the chambers. So you have a fluid dynamic process that's moving water up into the system and then draining out. There's a phenomenon called surface adhesion, where gases will adhere to the surface of moving water. So by draining the water out of the second chamber, you're allowing the gases to move from your high pressure system in reactor number 1, adhering to the surface of the water, flowing through the connecting shaft into the secondary chamber. Mm-hmm. And that's why we have that staining pattern on the southern wall of the primary chamber, because those gases were flowing across that wall in through the connecting shaft. So the fluid dynamic staining inside of the red pyramid is a perfect indication of the chemical reaction sequence that was occurring inside of the structure.
How tall are these chambers?
So I don't know. So I focus on the chemistry.
Right.
I don't know the specific measurement of all these things, but you're looking at 30 feet, just off a rough estimate.
So I guess like I don't understand why do they need to be so enormous?
Yeah. So you want to produce a large volume of chemicals, right? So the larger the chambers, the larger volume that you can extract. So for example, the final synthesis chamber, imagine that entire volume of the chamber being filled with water.
The top one.
Correct. That is the volume of aqueous ammonia that you can extract per each production cycle.
Okay.
So the larger the volume of chemical that you're producing.
Okay, and then where does it drain after it drains out?
Yep.
Where does it go? Where do they collect it?
Yeah. So there could have been off-site collection where you just have a shaft that leads to a collection area. There's temples that are usually adjacent to these structures. So the temples were either designed for production of raw materials, like the temple adjacent to the step pyramid, or they were designed for collection, like we saw at the Pyramid of Nayusere in Abusir, with that collection bowl.
Well, that thing was like that bowl
That
compared
thing was
to the
small.
size of that.
Correct, yeah. And so the internal reaction chambers inside the Pyramid of Nayusere are much, much smaller than this. And
Okay.
I have an intuition that the reaction occurring inside the Pyramid of Nayusere involved dissolving metal particles, metal nanoparticles. So that's another reason for the implementation of the red quartzite, because red quartzite also has crystalline quartz inside of the material. So we have the electric field, again, interfacing with the stone dielectric materials, activating the inverse piezoelectric property that produces ultrasound vibrations. Ultrasound vibrations are another way to create nanoparticles and to keep particles suspended in your solution. So they were implementing these different types of geology for specific applications within each one of these pyramids. And that's the reason why they didn't just use limestone in that conduit and collection bowl system, is because of the ultrasound properties of the red quartzite. And we'll get to how that works inside the Great Pyramid as well.
Okay.
So long story short, your methane is converted into hydrogen and carbon monoxide. In the next chamber, that hydrogen and carbon monoxide are mixed with air that has oxygen and nitrogen, which creates carbon dioxide, which will dissolve into solution inside of the secondary reformer. You can eliminate that byproduct by draining the solution. And then the northern pump literally is used to compress the water inside of the chambers using a pump mechanism, pushing the water through the first two chambers and raising it up into the final synthesis chamber. So you've removed your carbon dioxide byproduct by dissolving it into a solution. You drain the chamber, and then you raise the water again, activate your pump. It pushes all the water through the system into the final synthesis chamber. So now you've isolated your nitrogen and hydrogen within your final synthesis chamber. You raise the water, it increases the temperature and pressure to facilitate the reaction between the nitrogen and hydrogen to produce ammonia, which is the exact same process that we use in the modern Haber process, the exact same thing.
Okay, and this has been duplicated, and it's proven that this is how it works, and it can be and it's tested.
Yes, correct. Within the modern Haber process. Now,
it's not how we do it today.
yeah, this is exactly.
It's exactly how we do it today.
The only difference is that today, the ammonia gas that is produced in the final synthesis reactor is then supercooled to produce liquid ammonia. In my theory, the ammonia gas, it's highly soluble in water. So if you have ammonia gas and water in the same chamber, the ammonia gas is going to dissolve in the water, creating an aqueous ammonia solution. This also prevents the reverse breakdown. Ammonia is a relatively fragile molecule, so you want to remove that product from the system as soon as possible, and it facilitates the forward momentum of the reaction process by immediately dissolving this gaseous ammonia into water, which allows the remainder of the nitrogen and hydrogen to continue reacting inside the chamber. So it's not liquid ammonia. That's a big difference between the modern process, which is liquid, supercooled ammonia gas, and the ancient process, which is a solution of ammonia gas dissolved in water.
Okay. And then after it goes through here, where does it go?
Goes to the bent pyramid. So again, I was just talking about ammonia, the etymology of our modern word for ammonia, tracing back to the deity Ammon. And
fertility.
you can see those two things. Those are sheaves of wheat growing out of his crown, which represent fertility and the growth of crops. So even in our modern process, you have your ammonia manufacturing facility in close proximity to a secondary chemical reaction facility used to create ammonium bicarbonate or urea, which is a solid compound made from ammonia. And that's exactly what we have in Dashur with the red pyramid and the bent pyramid. Again, I was talking about the connection and the geometry between these two structures, where you take the geometry of the red pyramid, you can stick it right on top of the bent pyramid. That's indicating the connection and the function of the two structures. As you take chemical 1, you introduce it into chemical processing plant number 2 and convert it into a solid compound.
Okay.
That's what was happening inside of the bent pyramid. I haven't released this theory publicly yet, but I have a secondary theory about the function of the bent pyramid, that it was used to produce nitric acid. And there's some significant erosion inside of the bent pyramid that lends me to this interpretation as opposed to the urea or ammonium bicarbonate. Okay. But as I was saying, inside the red pyramid, I know I'm kind of rushing through this and it's so much to try to tackle in a short amount of time, but I want to make sure that we cover all of these pyramids in sequence so that we can get to the crescendo, which is talking about the function of the Great Pyramid.
Right.
So you take the carbon dioxide byproduct from the red pyramid that was removed in stage 2, you transport it into the bent pyramid, and then you use that carbon dioxide and you mix it with the ammonia to create ammonium bicarbonate by percolating the gas up through an ammonia solution in the primary reactor of the bent pyramid, which you can see here on the left.
Yes.
So the bent pyramid is an extremely perplexing structure, and there's a ton of erosion that has occurred inside of the primary reaction chamber. Originally, it was a perfectly tiered vault system, just like we see in the red pyramid. But if you go in there today, the internal chamber of the primary chamber is completely eroded. It's basically smoothed out. And there's a platform inside there that, even according to the conventional dynastic timeline, was added later to the structure. So the platform inside of there is not an original part of the reaction chamber system. And conventional archaeology would agree with that the platform came later inside of that chamber.
Okay.
So as I was mentioning before, this time period of the Saharan wet period.
Yeah, what are all these red dots you have here?
Yeah, so the red dots indicate the population density.
Okay.
So prior to 8500 BC, all of the population was around the Nile River. Sometime around 8500 BC, you see the beginning of the Saharan wet period, where there was tons of rainfall. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, all this rainfall starts to occur. You see the population then move away from the Nile River into these arable farmlands in the upper eastern Sahara. So this is what I believe the number one application for these fertilizers and the generation of these thunderstorm systems was the terraforming of the upper eastern Sahara during this time period. And the function of the pyramids are directly related to the transformation of this desert into farmlands.
Okay.
Using these fertilizers and thunderstorm generation systems. But then something happens around 5000 BC, and we see a lot of cataclysms and earthquakes and floods that all happen around this time frame, which is when the pyramids went offline. Something happened where these structures were no longer operational. 2,000 years later.
5,000 BC?
Yeah, around 5,000 BC. Then you see the population moving back around the Nile River. And then we have the beginning of the dynastic Egyptian timeline sometime around 3,500 BC.
Right.
So my theory focuses on this time period, and it's a bit closer to the dynastic Egyptian pyramid, but it does address the terraforming system that was happening in the upper eastern Sahara as being directly correlated to the operation of the Egyptian pyramids.
Okay.
So this is just showing the lower separation chamber of the bent pyramid.
Right. I think this is huge.
Has anybody replicated the, would you say the red pyramid? and how it can create this ammonia.
Correct. Yeah, so I have a friend and follower of the channel. Shout out John. I don't know if he wants his last name out in public, but he's a huge supporter of the channel. And he has access to all of these materials where he can build replicas. So we have a work in progress scale model of the Red Pyramid that's being developed to test all of these sort of things. This one is going to be made of... I forget the name of the plastic that he's building this thing out of, but it's basically a plastic model of the internal chambers that will allow us to test the fluid dynamic process, right? So basically the movement of water through the structure using this pump mechanism that I've proposed in the hypothesis.
Right.
So building it out of plastic doesn't allow us to test the chemical reactions, and certainly building these things out of stone would be a monumental undertaking, even just doing it on a small scale. So this is an indication of the complexity of the construction process that went into designing and building these things. Because even to do it on a small scale, out of the correct materials with the execution in such a way that you can facilitate these chemical reactions, maintain all the pressure, make sure that the whole thing doesn't explode, right? To do it on a small scale with limestone and black basalt and red granite and all of these construction materials, that would be a task in and of itself, just to carve them on a small scale and rebuild this thing.
Right.
So to do it on this sort of monumental scale is just, it's completely mind-blowing, the execution of the construction process.
Yeah, it really is, man. It is amazing that no one's tried to actually like replicate any of this stuff, like even on a small scale using the same materials.
So I will say that, and you'll see this here in a second, so we have a modern reaction process that literally emulates the ancient process for manufacturing the same chemical. We have modern biogas digesters that have the exact same configuration as the step pyramid. You'll see here with our modern day contact process for the production of sulfuric acid, it literally mimics the configuration of the Great Pyramid chambers. So I believe, individuals like Fritz Haber and these early industrial scale chemists were extrapolating ancient knowledge. All of these dudes were into esoteric stuff.
Yeah.
The Royal Society of Chemistry comes from the lineage of ancient alchemists in the medieval period. The Royal Society of Chemistry was literally the development of modern chemistry. All of these guys come from the lineage of alchemists, and the lineage of alchemists all trace their knowledge back to ancient Egypt. So I do believe that the impetus for our modern industrial revolution was due to reverse engineering of the Egyptian pyramids, discovering the chemicals that they were manufacturing back then to transform the civilization, which was directly applicable to the transformation of our modern civilization, specifically with ammonia and sulfuric acid. Ammonia and sulfuric acid are the two most important chemicals that we manufacture today on an industrial scale. Literally, the measurement of an industrial civilization is the volume and consumption of sulfuric acid. The more sulfuric acid you produce and consume, the more industrialized your civilization is. So because of these two chemicals, our modern world has completely transformed. And I truly believe that it's because of reverse engineering of the Egyptian pyramids that we were able to develop these processes.
Now, have you seen Chris Dunn's video that he did where he did an experiment on the shafts and the chambers inside the Great Pyramid using, I think it was hydrochloric acid and hydrated zinc?
Yes.
Where he claims that they were introduced into those chambers that go into those shafts that go into the Queen's chamber, and there was some sort of a reaction that happened inside the Queen's chamber, and he did it, and it like worked. It created this little like electric spark or whatever on the end of this little like I don't know what you call it, like a little metal fitting he had.
Right. So I haven't seen the video, but I'm vaguely familiar with Christopher Dunn's theory. And
You've read his books, right?
I've never read the books.
Okay.
I was kind of introduced into his theory like back in 2000, maybe 12, 15 time frame. And I've never really delved too deeply into it. So I understand it only at a surface level, where there was hydrochloric acid being introduced into the Queen's chamber,
right,
reacting with hydrated zinc to liberate hydrogen. So that he proposes that the Queen's chamber was designed to produce hydrogen.
Right.
And there's I give all the credit in the world to Christopher Dunn, and I have huge respect and just admiration for everything that he's done. He is a pioneer in the ancient interpretation of the function of the Egyptian pyramids, industry or whatever it is that we're doing and try to learn what the Egyptian pyramids are. He's the godfather of all of it. So I have immense respect for Christopher Dunn. I happen to disagree with his conclusions for a number of reasons. But again, he's the godfather and the pioneer. And if he hadn't done the work, I probably would never be doing this today. So he's a huge inspiration, but I never really dove completely into his work because at the end of the day, I disagreed with the conclusions that he had reached. So I didn't fully immerse myself in trying to understand his work because mine pointed me in a completely different direction. And there's a number of reasons that point to sulfuric acid inside of the Great Pyramid as opposed to hydrochloric acid. I also do propose a hypothesis of where hydrochloric acid could be manufactured in the Central Pyramid using the sulfuric acid from the Great Pyramid. So these our theories are connected and they're certainly adjacent, but mine is a completely different operational structure than what Dunn is proposing.
His theory, if you haven't read the recent book, it's essentially that the Great Pyramid is a solid state electron harvester.
Yes.
And that the reason that the pyramid takes up 13 to 14 acres in the base of it. I lost you. I lost the image. Anyways, was that the reason the base is so big, 13 acres, is because that area of land on the Giza plateau had lots of seismic activity.
Okay.
And there was some sort of a device inside the subterranean chamber that would operate and sort of create mini earthquakes in the ground that would vibrate the earth underneath the pyramid. And basically it used the earth as a battery, and these little mini earthquakes that would happen would vibrate up through all the stones and all the granite and all the limestone in the pyramid. That combined with the chemicals that were introduced into the shafts in the Queen's chamber to create hydrogen in the Queen's chamber would go up the Grand Gallery and then supercharge the hydrogen in the King's chamber.
Okay.
And one of the shafts in the King's chamber was like a maser or a laser that would somehow, I forgot, I don't know how to explain what it did, but and then the other one would shoot out the other shaft in the King's chamber.
Okay.
And somehow there was some sort of a dome structure that could have been placed around the pyramid, and that's what it used to use this supercharged hydrogen to emit wireless electricity.
Right.
But, the biggest argument against it is there's no toasters that we found. There's no ancient toasters that we dug up in ancient. So what were they, what were they powering?
Right.
But the idea that he has is that there's definitely chemicals, and he claims that there was a number of, you depicted it on your diagram of one of the other pyramids, where outside of the Great Pyramid there was like these big pits.
Correct.
Where they could have introduced or pumped chemicals into those pits.
Correct.
And he thinks that those pits are connected to the shafts in the Queen's chamber. And that's how they introduced the chemicals into the Queen's chamber. And then there's also the exploration they did up the Queen's chamber where they sent the robot up there to find Gate and Brink's door.
Correct, yeah.
And there's 2 electrodes.
Yes, yeah.
On the block that kind of like ends that Queen's chamber. And he thinks that basically when the Queen's chamber was full to the right amount, whenever like the liquid would touch those electrodes, it wouldn't fill anymore.
Correct. Okay.
To keep a certain amount of pressure or whatever it was.
Yeah. So I'm familiar with all those details, and there's some similarities between what I think was happening inside the Great Pyramid with Dunn's work, but there's also a lot of differences. So one thing that's important to note in terms of the archaeological record and evidence inside of the Queen's chamber, that the shafts leading into the Queen's chamber were sealed on the inside.
Right.
Right, with 5 inches of stone. So those shafts leading into the Queen's chamber were never originally open into that chamber.
And he claims that the chemicals that it was designed that way so the chemicals could seep through slowly. Kind of the way you explained it in those other chambers that in the other pyramid, how you said like it's kind of like slowly oozing out the chemicals.
Right. So there's a big difference to explain here. What was happening inside the Red Pyramid, those are metal oxides that are normally occurring inside of the limestone. The fluctuations of heat and temperature inside the reaction chambers of the red pyramid are causing these extrusions. If you have hydrochloric acid flowing into limestone, it is not going to seep through. It will completely dissolve the limestone. Hydrochloric acid is a very, very potent acidic solution, very, very strong chemical, and it will completely dissolve limestone.
Really?
Correct.
So if those shafts going into the Queen's chamber were filled with hydrochloric acid,
it would dissolve it away
the stones
completely
at the bottom.
Correct. So there's one important thing to point out is that is sealed from the inside, 5 inches of stone that they had to break through.
Yeah, a guy found like a little hole and he stuck like a rod up there.
Yeah, basically. And they chiseled away the rock. And we've been inside of the Queen's chamber and you can see where they broke through the stone to access those shafts. Now, the second thing is, and Christopher Dunn even has this in his first book, where he wrote that they discovered a calcium sulfate coating inside of the Queen's chamber and inside of the Grand Gallery. So the inside of the Queen's chamber and the Grand Gallery were completely coated with calcium sulfate salt, which is a direct result of the reaction between sulfuric acid and calcium carbonate. And it just so happens that calcium sulfate is insoluble in dilute sulfuric acid.
Say that again.
So what happens, right? During the first production process inside the Great Pyramid, you manufacture your sulfuric acid solution that fills the Grand Gallery in the Queen's chamber.
Okay.
That sulfuric acid is going to react with the limestone, and it creates a solid layer of calcium sulfate.
Okay.
That calcium sulfate salt is unreactive with sulfuric acid. So once you create this layer of salt, you've literally created a chemically resistant coating compound that protects the inside of the chambers from further corrosion. So when you have acids and stone, this is not a good combination. You have to have a chemically resistant coating compound to prevent corrosion damage inside. Yep, exactly.
When limestone, this is Google. We found this on Google. When limestone reacts with hydrochloric acid, it will form calcium chloride,
Correct.
Water, and carbon dioxide as the final product.
Correct. And there was no calcium chloride discovered in this salt. There was calcium carbonate, sodium chloride, which is naturally occurring in limestone, and calcium sulfate. And I got an email, we were talking about this last night, how in the appendix of Christopher Dunn's new book, he has a chemical engineer that writes an appendix to his book where he was saying that if any chemicals were being produced inside of is Dr. Brett Cohen, and he says if any chemicals were being produced inside of the Great Pyramid, it's most likely sulfuric acid and not hydrochloric acid due to this calcium sulfate coating. And he proposes it could have been through a method of dry distillation of ferrous sulfate, which is also a chemical that I've proposed was being produced in these ancient structures. So Dr. Cohen and I have had a conversation.
What does it say? When sulfuric and nitric acids in polluted air and rain react with calcite in marble and limestone, the calcite dissolves.
Correct. Yeah. So the stone basically breaks down the hydrochloric acid, and this will happen with sulfuric acid too. But the thing about the sulfuric acid reaction with limestone is the calcium sulfate coating. And it's super important detail in understanding the archaeological evidence that was found inside of these structures. There was no calcium chloride. It was calcium sulfate. So that is literal. It's not proof of anything. I don't like to say proof, but it's certainly evidence that there was sulfuric acid inside of the chamber as opposed to hydrochloric acid. And we also have these...
In the Queen's chamber in the Grand Gallery.
The Queen's chamber in the Grand Gallery, correct. And only inside of those two chambers. And it was literally coated. And there's an article by Dr. Hawass where they talk about the mechanical removal of all of this calcium sulfate. They call it gypsum, it's calcium sulfate, which gypsum is essentially a plaster. So it could have been applied mechanically or by hand where they plaster coated the inside of these chambers to prevent any reactions. Yep, gypsum, calcium sulfate. So the Great Pyramid had a very sophisticated mechanism of operation where it created a self-protective coating compound that protected the inside of the chamber.
Okay.
So I propose that the King's chamber is actually a sulfur furnace reaction chamber where sulfur dioxide was introduced into the chamber, and it was reacted with air. So you do have these air shafts leading into the king's chamber. And my hypothesis is that they were literally just air intakes. You don't have, he said that, the maser and the hydron emission and all this stuff. It's literally just an air intake to bring air into your furnace chamber.
Okay.
Because you need air to facilitate the reaction of sulfur dioxide and oxygen into sulfur trioxide.
Okay, but if it was one of those air intakes in the king's chamber has like a crazy bends to it, where it goes around
Yes.
that new void they found that's like the size of a jumbo jet or
Correct.
something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
So was the scan pyramids or something? The
Yep.
scan pyramid project, they scanned it and they figured out there's this big undiscovered void.
Correct.
That's next to the grand gallery, and one of those shafts that goes out of the king chamber does all these crazy like right turn and angles to avoid that thing.
Correct.
To wrap around it.
Yes.
So like that's another crazy question to this thing. If they built this like amazing machine out of these massive blocks,
Yeah.
and they had a plan to do this, why wouldn't they build it in a better way where it could just be like a straight shaft out and then be like, instead of trying to like avoid some other part of it that they built? It seems like they just like, if like either they just figured it out as they went and they were like, oh shit, we gotta work our way around this big void,
Yeah.
or all those angles that they took with that shaft were by design.
Yeah. So I think that there was meticulous engineering in these things, and everything that they did was very intentional. And I love the fact that you brought up this big void, because it's located above the quote unquote grand gallery chamber.
Right.
And I have a perfect explanation for what this thing was doing and how it was implemented into this chemical reaction process. Because the reaction of dissolving sulfur trioxide into water is an extremely exothermic reaction, generates a ton of heat. So if you have an ancillary chamber above your contact process chamber where that reaction was occurring, you can absorb that heat energy and remove it from the structure. This directly ties into the function of the black basalt floor that is adjacent to the Great Pyramid, because that hot water from inside of the void above the Grand Gallery was flowing out of that chamber and running through the channels that are underneath this black basalt floor on the eastern side of the Great Pyramid, heating up that material.
Do you have like an image of this I can see so I can better understand it?
So let's say here,
Okay.
probably not in this particular, but we can just run through this
Okay.
part real quick.
Okay.
So again, air was coming through those air intakes
In the king's chamber.
In the king's chamber.
Okay.
That mixture of gases was being pulled through the antechamber. And the antechamber of the Great Pyramid is made from red granite along with this furnace chamber. And I've already mentioned that.
You're saying the antechamber was the furnace chamber, or no? Or that was the king's chamber?
The antechamber is actually your catalyst chamber. It is a sound catalyst chamber, something called sonochemistry, acoustic chemistry, where you can use sound waves to catalyze chemical reactions. This goes back to the inverse piezoelectric property of quartz, where electric fields were flowing into the red granite and activating the inverse piezoelectric property of quartz, creating vibrations that elicit ultrasound. And ultrasound is basically sonochemistry. They use ultrasound vibrations to create chemical reactions.
Okay.
And that's what was occurring inside of the antechamber. And I have a whole slide deck on the sonochemical reactions inside of the Great Pyramid.
So
And
which one of these chambers is what?
Yep. Okay, so let's go back here.
Okay, the burner is the king's chamber.
Correct. Yeah, the converter where you see SO2 going into a catalyst chamber.
Yes.
That's your antechamber.
Okay.
Then you have your absorption tower, which is your grand gallery, and your dilution and extraction tank is your queen's chamber.
Okay.
So keep this configuration in mind, where you have king's chamber, antechamber, contact process chamber,
Grand
and
gallery.
extraction chamber.
Okay.
So again, another depiction here showing the process.
Okay.
And this is, again, just kind of an explanation of how sulfuric acid is utilized as for the manufacture of fertilizers, metallurgical processes, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll get to the configuration of the Great Pyramid here in just a second. But if you take the sulfuric acid that was being produced in the Great Pyramid, and then you introduce it into the Central Pyramid, which is the middle pyramid on the Giza Plateau, you can fill that chamber with a concentrated solution of sodium chloride. Introduce your sulfuric acid solution into that chamber, and it will create hydrogen chloride gas, which can then be dissolved into water to create hydrochloric acid. So there's a connection between my work and Christopher Dunn's work in that I do believe hydrochloric acid was being manufactured on the Giza Plateau. And I don't think he goes into an explanation of where the hydrochloric acid comes from.
No.
But in the Central Pyramid, it has the exact same configuration, and they found a sodium chloride coating inside the chambers of the Central Pyramid. So you need sodium chloride, salt, to create the chemical reaction between sulfuric acid and the sodium chloride to create hydrochloric acid. And they found that salt coating inside of the chamber, the primary chamber of the Central Pyramid.
Okay, so can you explain to me one more time?
Yes.
The Great Pyramid.
Yeah.
All of the chambers. Where does this process start?
All right. So the process actually starts in the subterranean chamber.
Okay.
And there's a guy named John Cadman that proposed that the subterranean chamber is a pump chamber. He believes that it was used to pump water out of the structure through that southern shaft outside of the subterranean chamber. So there's a shaft going down into the subterranean chamber from the north. There's a pit leading out of the bottom, and then there's a shaft going out of the southern end.
That goes nowhere, right?
That goes nowhere, correct. So John Cadman's theory is that it was a pump to pump water out of that southern shaft. The big issue with that is it's a completely dead-end shaft.
Right.
And I was just in there for a special permission inside the Great Pyramid, and we got great documentation where all of us climbed through that southern shaft because I wanted to get it on camera to prove that that was a dead-end shaft and nothing could be pumped out in that direction. But I do believe that the configuration of the subterranean chamber is indicative of a pump chamber that pumped water from the subterranean chamber up through the well shaft into the Grand Gallery and Queen's Chamber.
Okay.
So
and where did the water come from? Just like the ground?
So there's subterranean water below the Great Pyramid for sure, but all of these pyramids had external reservoirs. They had enclosures surrounding the structures that were filled with water to facilitate these chemical reactions. And even in the ancient descriptions, they talk about the pyramids being floating islands. So they were surrounded by these reservoir enclosures that were utilized, for example, in the operation of the Red Pyramid. The water from the reservoir was introduced into that inlet shaft and utilized to facilitate the chemical reactions inside the Red Pyramid.
Okay.
Same thing happened in the Great Pyramid where that water was introduced into the subterranean chamber. The northern pump shaft was filled, right? So you have an external reservoir.
Do you have a diagram?
Let's see here.
Okay, right there. That's perfect.
Yeah.
So number 5, the subterranean chamber is, bless you.
Yep. So the external reservoir surrounding the Great Pyramid basically came up to where you see the number 1, where that inlet shaft is. So the water would have poured down into the subterranean chamber. And if you put a pump block into that northern chamber and compressed it down into the shaft, it will push water up through that well shaft.
The vertical one.
Correct. And I believe that there's even important information encoded in the conventional archaeological nomenclature, right? It's a well shaft. They call it a well shaft.
Okay.
So what's the function of a well? To deliver water. So that is the exact function of this well shaft, is by activating your subterranean pump chamber, you're pumping water up through the well shaft, delivering it into your Queen's Chamber and Grand Gallery chamber.
Now, number 6, was that originally there, or was that dug through?
Yeah, so where you see number 2 here, that is the excavated cavity that was carved into the Great Pyramid to gain access into the structure in the modern day.
Right.
In number 6 is a vertical, like a diagonally inclined shaft that has these granite plug blocks. And even the conventional archaeology states, and that's why I have this little red circle, because these red granite blocks were originally at the top of that shaft. And it was an emergency shut-off mechanism that if the pressure inside of the chamber ever got too high, it would release those plug blocks, push them down into the bottom of that shaft to relieve the pressure inside of the system. So there was something catastrophic that happened to these Egyptian pyramids that caused them to go offline. And they all have emergency shut-off mechanisms built in, same thing as you would have with a modern chemical reactor, where if something goes catastrophically wrong, you have to have an immediate shut-off valve to prevent the situation from just blowing the whole structure to pieces.
Right.
So that was my idea on the function of these red granite plug blocks and of shaft number 6.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to skip ahead a little bit, but let's imagine that the Great Pyramid gets struck by lightning. There's an accumulation of positive charges from these telluric currents in the earth. So you have these flowing electrical currents that move through the crust of the earth. And this is where these dielectric materials are incredibly important. So Chris Dunn talks about seismic waves. I'm talking about naturally occurring electric currents in these telluric currents that are flowing below these structures. And the limestone is a dielectric material that is going to store these electric charges and cause a phenomenon called dielectric polarization of the material. And this is how batteries work today, where you get a slight negative charge at the bottom, slight positive charge at the top. You have a separation of your charges that allow the storage of electricity. So this is why modern batteries, you have a conductor, you have a dielectric material, and another conductor. And it's the magic of these dielectric materials that allow us to store energy in batteries. This is exactly what was happening inside of all of these structures, including the ancient structures of England and Ireland, where they were storing electric currents from these telluric earth currents on the surface of the earth. And they either have obelisks, pillars, or standing stones, or at the Great Pyramid being the tallest structure. Well, technically the Central Pyramid is the tallest one, but I truly believe that the Great Pyramid was designed without a capstone. It was meant to be flat at the top, which increases the surface area at the top of the pyramid to allow the accumulation of positive charges. And I have there's another episode that I've done on the channel where they've introduced electromagnetic charges into a simulation of the Great Pyramid, and it was designed to accumulate charges directly where the capstone is missing. So in this experiment, they introduced an electromagnetic field into a simulated design of the Great Pyramid. And there's literally a flat part at the top of the structure where all of these charges accumulate where there is no capstone. It's in the exact same location. And I believe that was the intentional design of the Great Pyramid, was to leave it without a capstone to allow the accumulation of positive charges on the surface of the structure to attract these lightning strikes.
Okay. And they needed the lightning strikes because it would charge the stones and blocks inside the pyramid?
Correct. Yeah. So the limestone, again, is a dielectric material, and it is going to store the electric fields from these lightning strikes. And this is also how these ancient stone circles like Avebury, they were used to attract lightning strikes by harnessing these electric fields on the surface of the earth. You have a standing stone or a pillar, which provides the lightning strike a location to hit, and then they distribute the electric fields throughout the rest of the temple complex. So Avebury is known as the Serpent Temple Complex. And I believe that the serpent is an ancient symbol for, well, there's also the plumed serpent, the deity Kukulkan, which descends onto the pyramid of Teotihuacan. This is another symbol encoded in that structure that indicates lightning. We'll get to that here in just a second. I've got some slides on Teotihuacan and the symbolism of the feathered serpent.
Right.
Lightning, right? The plumed serpent. That is an ancient symbol for lightning strikes.
I always thought the serpents were like comets. I thought they were depictions of comets coming down with like fiery tails.
It could possibly be.
Could be both.
It certainly could be. Again, multiple interpretations of these symbols. But I do believe that the serpent imagery is indicative of knowledge of electricity.
Okay.
So here it is. Perfect. I'm glad I have this slide in here. So this is the Great Pyramid's ability to concentrate electric fields. And they introduced electric fields into the Great Pyramid in a software called COMSOL Multiphysics, which allows for simulations of a variety of different of physics and chemistry. It's a great piece of software. I contacted these people when I began research this thing. I was like, I have this crazy idea about the function of the Egyptian pyramids. Can we rebuild the pyramids inside your software? And this guy was like, whoa, 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 whoa. He's like, our software is not designed to do that in terms of building it stone from stone materials. What we can do is put in the geometry of the Great Pyramid, which is what you see here. You see here on the right. So this rectangle.
Yes.
This is where the king's chamber is located inside of the Great Pyramid.
That's so interesting that it's not centered.
Right. So you can see here on the left that the red, the highest accumulation of the electric field, is located in the exact location of the king's chamber. The king's chamber is also directly adjacent to the antechamber, which here on the right, you could see that the antechamber within this configuration would also experience this highest concentration of electric fields.
So the king's chamber is a little bit off to the side.
Correct.
So the antechamber, is that more in the center, like the very center?
So
or
if
does
you
that
were to-
even matter?
It does because,
Okay.
again, the electric fields from these lightning strikes would be distributed through the entire structure, but they are going to be focused in the area surrounding the king's chamber and the antechamber. And this was done intentionally. Let me see if I have the other one in here. So I didn't put it in this particular one. But you can see here, when they change the frequency of the electromagnetic energy being introduced into the structure, you see on the right where it turns blue and there's almost no accumulation? When they lower the wavelength of the electromagnetic radiation being introduced, the entire top of the structure turns red.
When they lower the wavelength.
Correct.
The tip of it gets red?
The tip of the pyramid, so again, this diagram, it's showing the concentration of electric fields. So the blue is the lowest concentration, and the red is the highest concentration of electric fields inside of the structure.
Right.
When they change the wavelength, you can see here at the top, one of them's 230 and the other one's 200. They're testing different wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation.
Okay.
And when they change the wavelength, all of a sudden the top of and I wish I had this diagram because it comes from the same paper, the entire top of the Great Pyramid turns red, but it leaves the blue area. So it's literally an indication that the Great Pyramid was intentionally designed without a capstone, because everything in green that you see there below the blue, that turns dark red, which is an indication that at this specific wavelength, the Great Pyramid is accumulating electric fields at the top of the structure, which is ideal for harnessing and attracting lightning because you want that separation of charges. If you have a bunch of positive charges, and I have it in the next slide deck.
Okay.
Yeah, awesome. I'm glad I chose this series of presentations because it really helps to kind of walk through the process. This is extremely complicated undertaking to understand all of the mechanisms of operation that go into these structures. And this is why people will spend their entire lives focusing exclusively on the Great Pyramid. Which even Christopher Dunn admits that, I forget the term that you used,
Yeah,
but like
Great Pyramid isolationist.
Right. And everybody focuses on the Great Pyramid.
Right. They don't talk about the other ones as much.
If it was the only functional structure that was ever built in Egypt, basically completely ignoring all of these other pyramids. So if you have a theory about the function of the Egyptian pyramids, I truly believe that it has to be a comprehensive structure or a comprehensive overview that can address each individual structure, the configuration of the chambers, the unique differences between the configuration of all of these chambers under the same umbrella. So if you look at it from the perspective of chemical manufacturing, it certainly makes sense that each pyramid has a specific design intended to create the chemical reactions that were for each specific chemical.
Right. Yeah. Look, you have the most wide spread theory that involves all of these pyramids, that I've absolutely ever seen. And there's lots of theories on the Great Pyramid, and I think that's good to have theories on the Great Pyramid. I mean, I don't fault people for not incorporating all the other pyramids, but I think it's super interesting that that you have an idea that basically ties all these things together.
I appreciate that. And I've dedicated my life to this, literally giving up everything that I've had to go all in on this. And I truly believe that, not to toot my own horn, but I believe I'm onto something in terms of the operations of these structures. Because if you take these same mechanisms of operation and the same physics regarding dielectric materials, and you apply this to all of the ancient structures across the world, everything just fits perfectly into place. And you can see it. We'll get to the White Horse Hills and Avebury, and it's using these exact same mechanisms of operation. Telluric currents, dielectric materials, storing charges on the surface of the earth, and then distributing them for various applications.
Have you heard of there's a NASA physicist his name is Friedman Freund. He did a TED talk where he basically he did a study on earthquake lights. Okay. So I don't know if you're familiar with the earthquake light phenomenon. There's basically a phenomenon that happens where lights, they look like UFOs, basically.
Right.
They come out of the earth in like seismically active areas, and they shoot up into the sky days and hours before an earthquake occurs.
Yeah.
And the reason that this happens is because of the rocks underneath the earth moving and grinding together. It charges the rocks or the granite and all the different whatever the rocks are down below the earth, and it charges them to emit these electrons, and these lights get shot up into the air. And his theory is, if you can detect these earthquake lights and monitor them in these areas of the earth, you can save people's lives by evacuating that part of the world or wherever it is, because there's probably going to be an earthquake there in the next couple days.
Right.
And they've done that where they've watched where and determined where these earthquake lights have come and recorded earthquakes happening immediately after that.
Correct. Yeah.
And he did another study in a laboratory where they got this stick or this long square rod of granite, and he squeezed it at one end, and he was able to put an electrode measuring device on the other end.
Right.
And they recorded electricity coming out of the granite by squeezing it at one end.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So that's the piezoelectric effect.
Right.
Where you have mechanical compression of quartz crystal containing material, for example, red granite. And that's probably what causes those earthquake lights is piezoelectric effect, where you have mechanical grinding of granite that releases electric charges. So a lot of people think that is involved in the operation of the Great Pyramid. But in the Great Pyramid, you don't have any mechanical dynamic pressure, right? So the piezoelectric effect is dynamic mechanical compression, not static weight. So a lot of people...
But if the ground was vibrating under the pyramid, that could happen.
So
it would charge the blocks, like the stones in those big granite blocks that are in the King's Chamber. If if 14 acres of earth is vibrating beneath that structure, wouldn't it charge those stones?
So the vibration, you have to remember that the body of the Great Pyramid is limestone.
Right.
So the limestone does not have the piezoelectric property.
So you're saying it would diffuse?
So nothing would happen. So to get to the internal core of the Great Pyramid, you have to get through a huge body of limestone, which is why the dielectric properties of limestone are critical to understanding the function of the Great Pyramid, because electric fields can permeate and be stored in limestone and also in granite. So that allows the electric fields to move into the core of the structure, is because of the limestone. And I believe it's something called the inverse piezoelectric property. So there's no moving components inside of the Great Pyramid. There's nothing causing that mechanical compression of the granite.
Right.
However, if you were introducing electric fields into the structure, those electric fields would move into the red granite and activate the phenomenon known as the inverse piezoelectric property, which creates sound vibrations, ultrasound vibrations. So everyone has talked about the acoustic properties inside of the Great Pyramid. And the acoustic properties and the activation of these sound properties of the pyramids has been one of the most speculated on aspects of the function of these structures. So the electric field introduced into the red granite, activating the inverse piezoelectric effect, gives the activation of the acoustic properties and the application of the acoustic properties related to ultrasound chemistry and catalyzing chemical reactions.
Okay.
I know we're going super deep into the weeds, into some really technical stuff.
No, it makes sense. It makes sense.
But so again, we're kind of talking about the same thing in regard to tectonic movements and telluric currents, because those things go hand in hand, right? Earthquakes and telluric currents are closely associated. These movements of electric currents through the Earth's crust are closely associated with earthquakes as well. So there is a connection in those two things, but I don't think it's necessarily the tectonic application, but more related to the electric currents flowing through the Earth that are causing the activation of the structure.
Got it. Okay.
And I'll kind of...
And what is the main difference between the tectonic and the telluric?
So tectonic is related to the movement of stone in the Earth's crust, like the plates of the Earth, right? Tectonic movements.
And what is telluric?
Telluric currents are electric currents that are moving through the crust of the Earth.
And how are they moving through the crust of the Earth? Like, where are they coming
It's
from?
naturally occurring in the electromagnetic field of the Earth. So the Earth is, again, what I was talking about at the beginning of the discussion, how our solar system is an interconnected electromagnetic system. The Earth is receiving electromagnetic currents from the sun. This is what causes the aurora borealis, is the electromagnetic energy flowing through the atmosphere into the Earth. So the Earth is a huge electromagnetic energy circuit, and it has electrical currents moving through the Earth's crust. That's what these telluric currents are. And this was a huge fascination of Tesla, was investigating the properties of these telluric currents. And I'll get to some research here in just a sec. So to kind of rush through this, here's another slide from this same experiment testing the electromagnetic concentration abilities of the Great Pyramid. And you can see here the top rectangle is the King's Chamber, the middle rectangle is the Queen's Chamber, and the lowest chamber at this particular frequency, there's actually concentration of electric fields inside of the subterranean chamber, which is a very, very interesting property at this particular wavelength. So this whole study is proving that the Great Pyramid was designed to concentrate electric fields inside of the structure. The geometry of the system is literally built to focus electric fields inside of these areas.
Okay.
So if you have the concentration of these electric fields around the King's Chamber, that's ideal if you're trying to produce ultrasound using the electric fields.
Right.
So you have that electric field concentration directly in this stone that has this inverse piezoelectric property to produce ultrasound vibrations. So the ultrasound vibrations are coming out of the red granite areas of the King's Chamber and the antechamber. Those acoustic vibrations permeate down into the grand gallery. So as the sulfur dioxide gas, there's these 4 grooves
in the antechamber?
In the antechamber, correct. And this allows the movement of sulfur dioxide gas from the King's Chamber through the antechamber into the grand gallery. And the antechamber was filled with 3 blocks of red granite. These are your acoustic catalyst generators.
And these were removed?
Correct.
How long ago were they removed?
They were removed in far, far antiquity.
Really?
Most likely during the original excavation into the Great Pyramid by Caliph al-Mamun. The guy who carved the tunnel in the entrance.
Right.
They broke through these pieces of red granite in the antechamber. And there's actually a couple of fragments down inside of the subterranean chamber of this original red granite.
Wow.
But they know that there were 3 huge blocks of red granite that were inserted into this antechamber. So these are your acoustic catalysts. Okay, so the electric field is concentrated into the antechamber. That electric field is captured by the dielectric red granite. That electric field activates the inverse piezoelectric property of the quartz, producing these ultrasound vibrations.
Which somehow has a reaction with the chemicals.
Yes. So by introducing ultrasound into a chemical reaction vessel, you are essentially activating those molecules, right? The more vibrations you have between these molecules, the more interaction and the more reaction. This is a modern field in chemistry called sonochemistry, sound chemistry, where you introduce these electric fields into your reaction vessels to create chemical reactions. And that's exactly what was happening within the antechamber to facilitate the reaction between sulfur dioxide and oxygen to produce sulfur trioxide. And it was after I released this episode on sonochemistry that I got the email from Dr. Brett Cohen congratulating me on the guy was in Christopher Dunn's appendix.
Wow.
He sent me the email congratulating me on my work on the acoustic activation of chemical reactions inside the Great Pyramid. And we started a conversation. He was like, I presented this paper in the appendix of Chris Dunn's book talking about dry distillation of ferrous sulfate. If you dry distill ferrous sulfate, you can release sulfur dioxide, which is a direct connection between his work and my work on the Great Pyramid. And then I sent him a list of emails because I've been working on ferrous sulfate since 2017 as another chemical that was being produced by this ancient civilization, specifically inside the reaction chambers of Newgrange.
Okay.
Yeah.
Newgrange in Ireland?
Newgrange in Ireland. And Newgrange has a curbstone out in front of the structure. It's a big piece of stone that has all of these glyphs carved on the front of the structure. And I've interpreted those glyphs to be an alchemical series of symbols that depict a chemical reaction. It's literally an instruction manual sitting out in front of the structure that depicts the chemical reaction sequence inside of Newgrange.
You got images of this?
I believe so.
And how did you discover
So
Newgrange?
I definitely have. So I have 125.
Right.
It's a huge body of work that I've put out in the last 4 years on my YouTube channel. I have 125 research-based episodes, and now I think I'm up to 57 site visits where I go out to all of these structures, including Newgrange, and discuss on-site this hypothesis with on-site evidence supporting my conclusions. And I know somewhere in here I do have.
So
Yeah.
So after all of this stuff is done in the Great Pyramid, what is the final chemical that it makes, or what is the final product?
So inside of the Great Pyramid,
Yes.
we have sulfuric acid. Inside of the Central Pyramid, you have hydrochloric acid. And I didn't know that Chris Dunn had proposed a theory about these pits because I think it works in the opposite direction, where the chemical that was being produced inside of the Great and Central Pyramids actually flow into these pits.
On the outside.
On the outside, because these are pits that are filled with these iron oxide deposits that are rich with a variety of different metals.
Those pits are.
Correct. They're literally metallic ore leach mining pits. So today we currently use acidic solutions for something called leach mining, where you pour acids into your deposit of metal. The acids dissolve out the metals, and then you extract the solution containing all of the dissolved metals. It's a way to mine metals without physically having to remove the material.
Okay.
So that's what I believe these pits adjacent to the pyramids on the Giza Plateau. There's also prolific evidence of much larger leach mining operations. For example, adjacent to the Lost Pyramid in Dashur, there's an immense mining pit directly adjacent to this Lost Pyramid structure, which is it's a completely other structure that I fortunately, I do have some videos on my channel about the Lost Pyramid. All right, so let me do Newgrange.
These chemicals come out of the pyramid, and the chemicals come out of those pits on the outside.
Yes. So the acidic solutions from inside of the reaction chambers are pumped through these pits.
And do we know for a fact where those pits connect to? Or did they really connect to the Queen's Chamber like Chris Dunn theorizes?
I believe they do. So I agree with his theory.
Okay.
That the Queen's Chamber in the Great Pyramid is connected into these pits.
Okay.
So we also have a connection between the Tomb of the Birds that I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, where this is a huge metallic ore mining tunnel. And they were introducing these acidic solutions. The solutions flowed down the Giza Plateau, and everything was being collected in the Sphinx enclosure. So the Sphinx enclosure has tunnels on the back side of the Sphinx enclosure that nobody ever talks about, these tunnel openings on the back of the Sphinx enclosure. And these tunnel openings lead back to the central pyramid. And then also we had the corroboration of this idea by the lead inspector of the Giza Plateau that mentioned the tunnels that lead from the Great Pyramid down to the Sphinx enclosure.
Okay, but how does the chemicals get to those pits on the outside?
Yep. So
From the inside of the Great Pyramid.
So, for example, there was an extraction shaft out of the Queen's Chamber that was used to remove the aqueous solution, the dilute solution of sulfuric acid, from the Queen's Chamber, and then it's distributed across the Giza Plateau.
So there's a shaft in the bottom of the Queen's Chamber?
Correct. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
Directly below the niche. And this has been mentioned in all of the archaeological reports. So they excavated down below the niche. It's this area called the niche inside the Queen's Chamber. And they excavated down in there. And there's several archaeological reports that there's not only shafts, but chambers underneath there. Now, I also have another episode where they did a 3D Doppler radar scan of the Great Pyramid. And if you pull that up, 3D Doppler radar scan of the Great Pyramid, it reveals that there's a ton of hidden structures inside of the Great. I just don't have that episode. I have it in my body of work, but I just didn't pull it up for this particular conversation. But if you Google that, there you go. Yep, just pull up any of those images, and it actually revealed this extraction shaft below the Queen's Chamber. Yeah, synthetic aperture Doppler radar tomography of the Great Pyramid. And there's a whole bunch of very cool diagrams in this that show all of the...
I don't think you're going to find it here.
Yeah, no, keep scrolling down.
Math.
Yep.
You can go faster.
Yeah, so it talks... Yep. There we go. There we go.
There we go.
Up. Right there, yeah.
Okay, blow that up.
Yeah. So you see there's a whole bunch of hidden components still inside of the Great Pyramid. And if you look at number 13 and 15, that is the area right below the Queen's Chamber. You see that red square? So 13 is the Queen's Chamber right there in the center. Yep, 13. Okay. And you see that shaft leading out of the Queen's Chamber?
Yeah,
yep.
15.
Yep. So this is the extraction shaft.
And that we don't see that on modern diagrams of the pyramid?
No. So this was basically an illegal scan of the Great Pyramid. They use this Doppler radar technology to scan the Great Pyramid. And this is a diagram showing their interpretation of this Doppler radar scan results. But I found it very interesting that it does corroborate the existence of a shaft.
Shit. So that 15 could go to the shafts that go to the outside.
Yeah, so those are basically intermediary collection chambers. And those intermediary collection chambers would have been connected to the outside of the structure through a shaft system that allowed the solution to flow out of the reaction chambers onto the Giza Plateau.
Okay.
And I believe, for example, the trial passages adjacent to the Great Pyramid are actually part of a pumping system that was used to pump the solution across the Giza Plateau.
So this was all to just create sulfuric acid?
Yes. Sulfuric acid has a ton of applications, not only for mining, which I don't believe this was just for the Giza Plateau. We're talking about all across Africa.
Okay.
There is prolific evidence of significant mining activities all over Africa. So they were collecting some of the solution. They were using some of it for in situ leach mining, which means on site. And we do the same thing today where we have a production facility for sulfuric acid, producing the chemical on site for in situ leach mining.
Okay.
But that Doppler radar scan does corroborate the existence of the extraction shaft below the Queen's Chamber.
And and then obviously with the sulfuric acid, since sulfuric acid is known today as one of the chemicals we use in metallurgy.
Yes.
We assume that we use the sulfuric acid. They use the sulfuric acid to create metals and saws and tools and stuff.
Correct. Yeah, yeah. So you can use it for mining applications, but then you can also use it for purification and isolation of certain metals. So you can also use it to dissolve gold. When you have hydrochloric acid and nitric acid, you can create something called aqua regia, which is used to dissolve gold. Yeah, so you can see that there's some very intricate structures.
And that what's that 19, that green
19
thing?
is the void.
The big void. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So that so this paper is discussing the technical application of 3D Doppler radar scanning to examine ancient structures. That's why there's so much math in this thing, is they're really assessing the technological capabilities of the radar scanning and not necessarily the results. But they do present the results of the scanning, and then they extrapolate from those results a new diagram of hidden internal components inside the Great Pyramid. But they do substantiate, like you said, number 19, this large void above the Grand Gallery, which again, it's in a perfect location to capture the thermal energy that was being released during the exothermic reaction that creates sulfuric acid. And that thermal energy was being removed from the structure, flowing below the black basalt floor adjacent to the Great Pyramid that was directly involved in producing these thunderstorm clouds, producing more lightning. It was literally a thunderstorm and lightning generating system.
Whoa.
Which connects to Randall Carlson's work, where they discovered that the slope angle of the Great Pyramid is the ideal vector for creating the mixture of these two air fronts, hot air coming off of one side, cold air coming off of another side, and mixing in the atmosphere to create these cumulonimbus thunderstorm and lightning clouds. So we talk about the black basalt being a heat storage material. You're removing the heat energy from inside of the chemical reaction system. You're moving it under the black basalt floor. The air rushing over the black basalt floor is heated and swept into the atmosphere at the ideal angle for generating these cumulonimbus thunderstorm clouds and thus more lightning.
Got it. Which would strike the pyramid.
Correct.
And then charge all this.
Correct. So it's a self-repeating system where they're harnessing naturally occurring telluric currents to attract lightning. The chemical reaction sequence is used for chemical applications, but then it's also used to generate more lightning.
Right.
And
man.
This is just the tip of the iceberg. We haven't even gotten to the White Horse Hills of Wiltshire. But just to talk about Newgrange real quick.
Yeah. How did you discover this place?
This is Newgrange. I had an intuitive sense that there was a connection between the structures in Ireland and ancient Egypt. So I went to Ireland in 2018 on a research expedition, and I started to try to interpret these symbols on the Newgrange curbstone. And I gradually stumbled across this research about the preparation of ferrous sulfate or green vitriol. That shirt I was wearing last night with the green lion, that's an alchemical symbol for ferrous sulfate, otherwise known as green vitriol or the green lion. So you take iron disulfide and you have flowing moist airflow inside of your reaction chamber that gradually oxidizes your iron disulfide, transforming it into ferrous sulfate. So this is the reaction process where you have the reactants stacked in heaps inside of the chamber. You have moist airflow flowing through the chamber, and then you have this crystalline ferrous sulfate removed from the chamber. Well, these are the glyphs on the Newgrange curbstone that depict this exact same chemical reaction sequence. Like I said, it's an instruction manual.
Right.
This is an ancient chemical reaction sequence that was left for future generations to be able to interpret the function of this structure. So on the left, you have the reactants, the iron disulfide that's stacked inside the chambers inside of the structure. At the bottom, you have water flowing into the structure. You see those undulating lines that move from the right side of the stone toward the center of the stone?
Yep.
That represents water flowing into the chamber. The three spirals represent airflow circulating inside of the triple chamber system. So there's 3 reaction chambers inside of Newgrange, and you have 3 air spirals representing the circulation of this moist airflow. Here on the right, you see those crystals. those diamond shapes, those are your crystalline ferrous sulfate product being removed from the structure. And then in the top right, you have the sun. And it just so happens, so here's a kind of a diagram depicting what these symbols represent. You have the iron disulfide, you have circulating air, you have airflow moving through the chamber, and then you have your green crystalline ferrous sulfate being removed from that solution.
Boy, they sure were vague when they wrote this instruction manual.
I think it's actually pretty clear when you evaluate those symbols from that perspective. They really did a good job. You can see, again, this was an ancient language that to them this was very, very clear. But to us, we've lost the ability to interpret this language. But if you look at it from the perspective of alchemical symbols, you know, the symbols in alchemy, you might look at these things and like, how am I supposed to understand like this symbol right here? You know, the circle with the cross, this is an alchemical symbol for hydrochloric acid.
Wow.
Which is inside the central pyramid, which is my logo. And,
cool.
and speaking of, while we're on the topic, like I said, I come bearing gifts.
I love gifts.
So I brought you a couple things. So I thought you only had one son. And I wanted to bring something from halfway across the world from Egypt for you to give to your son. If I had known you had 2 kids, I would have brought 2.
Sorry, we'll let them fight over it.
So this is, of course, Land of Chem merch.
Oh, hell yeah.
Same shirt I'm wearing right now.
Sick.
The alchemical symbol for hydrochloric acid. And I took this picture of the central pyramid back in 2017, and it became my logo, and now I have it tattooed on my hand, the same symbol. So this is for you.
That's badass, man. Thank you.
I brought a copy of my book, The Land of Chem, An Initiation into Ancient Chemistry Through the Degrees of the Egyptian Pyramids. And this is the original purple orchid paper print. So when I went to reprint these things, I self-published my book. I built my website by myself. I had no idea how to do any of this when I got started. I had no idea how to make a YouTube video, no idea how to make a website, no idea how to write or publish a book. But I self-published this little book. And the original print with the purple metallic foil on the cover and the purple orchid, when I sold out, that was no longer available. So now it's reprinted. That's
beautiful, man.
Thank you. I went through a lot of, again, this represents my entire life work, and I'm so proud of how, and see on the inner cover, that's me
on a camel,
standing on a camel,
surfing the camel,
yeah, during my first research trip to Egypt. And
love it, man.
So I'm very proud of that. But when I went to reprint these things, that purple metallic foil and the purple paper doesn't exist anymore. So now it's reprinted in metallic blue and Egyptian blue internal paper. But that's the original print that's no longer available. So you got a really exclusive copy of that.
Thank you, man.
And I also brought you this from Egypt. And I've never seen one of these with this particular configuration. So scarabs.
Whoa.
So those are, symbols of good luck in Egypt. And I've never seen one with that particular configuration. That one's carved out of, I believe, soapstone.
Really?
But yeah, that came from halfway across the world. Again, I can't tell you how much.
Is this like a reproduction or something? Or is this?
Yeah, so they have ancient scarabs. Like they find hundreds of thousands of these things in all these ancient burials.
Right.
And they make these nowadays as modern replicas of these ancient artifacts. So it's made to look old.
That's so cool, man.
Yeah, but that's not an ancient artifact.
That's badass, dude. Thank you so much.
So I can't tell you how much I appreciate this opportunity. This is huge. I am unbelievably grateful for even the mere fact that you found my research somehow. We were talking, I've been working for years in relative obscurity and nobody knows about my channel. I have like 30,000 subscribers right now.
A lot of people know about you, man.
Well,
a lot of people have been hitting me up, telling me about you.
Well, that's good. It's because I have a very, very loyal following of people that have supported my channel since the very beginning. And it's such a huge opportunity for me. And often on these podcasts, I don't see guests express the overwhelming appreciation that I have for this opportunity. So I just wanted to tell you, thank you so much. And this is the least that I could do. And I wanted to bring you some, because I literally flew halfway across the world for this. we had another good reason for coming back to the United States to visit my family, and we're going to do our official wedding and all this kind of stuff,
Yeah,
and
that's
then get
amazing.
officially married.
Cool.
But the other reason was to come here and do this with you. I was originally planning, because I've been living in Egypt for about a year and 6 months.
Right.
The original plan was to come back in November for Thanksgiving, but after you and I started talking on Instagram, I couldn't wait until November to come out here and do this. So I was like, all right, well, I guess we're going back to the U.S.
Yeah.
So we started booking flights and getting this whole thing together.
I'm psyched we made this happen, brother.
Absolutely. So again,
We got more to talk about though.
yeah, so that basically covers the operation of Newgrange. Long
Okay.
story short, they were producing ferrous sulfate.
Yep.
And it just so happens that the guy that was featured in Christopher Dunn's work was also interested in ferrous sulfate for the
Yeah.
production of sulfuric acid. So there's been these very interesting synchronicities between
Right.
other people's work and mine, where
Right.
it's significantly different, but there's some interesting parallels in all of this work that indicate that there's a vein of truth in all of this. When you have independent researchers that have absolutely no connection stumbling across similar conclusions, that's a very good indication
Yeah.
that there's something there to be further pursued. And,
Right.
and that's what I've dedicated my life to in moving to Egypt, is trying to better understand the operation of these structures.
Yeah.
So now let's jump into, in my opinion, probably one of the most important episodes that I've ever produced, discussing how I came across the conclusion that all of these structures were designed to harness lightning. And this is by what I learned at the White Horse Hills of Wiltshire, England. I intuitively had the idea that the pyramids were powered by lightning, but I didn't understand the mechanisms of operation until I started looking at dielectric materials. Dielectrics, again, it's the secret in the stone, right? All of these stones are functional materials.
Right.
Black basalt storing heat, red granite for ultrasound, limestone for dielectric capacity of storing electric fields. There's a very specific reason that they chose all of these construction materials. And once you understand these properties, everything just starts to reveal itself. So here we have the Giza Plateau Chemical Manufacturing Plant. Sulfuric acid in the Great Pyramid. Hydrochloric acid in the Central Pyramid. And I haven't revealed my function of the third and final Menkaure pyramid, but it was operational and it was producing a chemical.
Now,
yes.
go back to that photo.
Yeah.
Those things are enormous.
Oh, it's crazy. Yeah.
And when I think about Chris Dunn's theory of the pyramids, right? His theory essentially is that Great Pyramid, whether the other two are involved or not, he does assume they're involved. He just doesn't explain. He doesn't have an explanation exactly for how it works. He doesn't reverse engineer the other two.
Right.
But when I look at those, I think that's got to have an extremely important role in whatever civilization lived around there
100%.
and built them.
Yes.
And when you think about something that provides energy to the entire civilization, that feels right.
Yes.
Because it's so monumental and so precise and so enormous.
Yep.
Now, when you look at there's nothing like those in the history of the earth. There's nothing like these things. Now, when you say that they're chemical processing plants for sulfuric acid and hydrochloric acid for mining and metallurgy,
Yes.
it's not as wild of a theory, right? It makes a lot of sense how that could work.
Yep.
I completely understand it, especially when you involve how the other pyramids are involved. But I just don't understand why. It seems like such a benign sort of like simple explanation for such an enormous, monumental, incredible feat
Yep.
of humans.
Okay. So, but that's only the chemical manufacturing application. So today, if we could harness the power from a lightning strike, you can power a city for a year off of one lightning bolt. It is a massive amount of electrical energy. It is the most powerful electrical phenomenon on this planet is lightning. So by harnessing lightning, they could produce, or harness rather, vast amounts of electric energy, which could then be distributed throughout the civilization. I don't get into that application because, again, I don't have any evidence of devices that were connected into this electricity. I believe it has other applications. For example, with the Serpent Temple complex in Avebury, that electric field energy was being distributed into something called the sanctuary, which was designed to accumulate negative ions and ozone, which are used for therapeutic applications and healing. So there's a completely different aspect that we haven't even, it's part of my, dude, for us to do this properly, I would need like 8 hours
Right.
to go through all of this material. So I have a slide deck ready for the Avebury Serpent Temple complex.
Where is this complex?
It's in, it's basically near the White Horse Hills in Wiltshire, England.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So all of these are a huge interconnected system. So remember, okay, so it's for chemical manufacturing. The most important process that we do in our modern world is manufacture chemicals. They are the basis of our entire modern civilization is chemistry. So it's incredibly important to our modern civilization, the production of chemicals. But we also have harnessing of electric field energy from lightning and terraforming. So they're literally turning a desert into a lush area of agricultural farmland. So it has all of the applications of electrical production, but then so much more.
Right. To feed the civilization that was there.
Everything. So we're not just producing mining chemicals. Remember, it's fertilizer, it's methane gas for heating and lighting and cooking and all of these sort of domestic applications. So you literally have a variety of chemicals that could sustain your entire civilization. Just the chemical manufacturing. Then you have a source of electric energy, not only for powering these chemical reactions, but also for therapeutic processes in these temples that we'll get to here in just a second, hopefully. And then you have terraforming, bringing these cumulonimbus thunderstorm clouds that rain. They also bear rain. So that's what I'm proposing, is that the Egyptian pyramids were involved in the terraforming of the Upper Eastern Sahara during the Saharan wet period. That by building these structures, they were creating more rain clouds that completely transformed the Sahara from a barren wasteland of sand into an area of lush agricultural development.
Wow. Okay.
So it has immense applications. And it's, again, to look at all of these three structures just on the Giza Plateau and only focus on the one, you're missing a huge part of the story. What were the other two doing? Why build the rest of this complex?
Right.
It's a huge complex that is connected underground. Again, the Tomb of the Birds, these underground mining tunnels that run below the Giza Plateau. What we can see above ground is only 50% of the story. There's so much more below the earth, underneath this temple complex, that will probably never be revealed, but we can only speculate on what's actually below there. But I've physically been down into the Tomb of the Birds, so I know that this does exist. And this tunnel is filled with all of this metallic ore, mineral deposits, and it looks like it's been leached out, just eroded out using acidic chemicals.
Wow, man.
And that's what these pits are on the Giza Plateau. So this is an image of these silicate microspherules that were discovered in the chemical analysis that was taken from around the trial passages, which are adjacent to the Great Pyramid, from fulgurites. So this is literally the closest evidence that we have that lightning was striking the area around the Great Pyramid. I believe it was striking the top of the structure directly. Those electric fields get distributed down into the bedrock, which is causing the creation of these fulgurites and these silicate microspherules.
Okay.
This sample was taken from around the trial passages, which you can see a diagram of here, which I believe was an intermediary pump station designed to pump these solutions across the Giza Plateau. Here's an area showing the opening of the trial passages, some of the iron ore where this sample was taken. So you see that red iron ore.
Right.
This stuff is all over the Giza Plateau, and it is eroded in such a way that is very indicative of acidic erosion. So I found it interesting that you mentioned that Dunn says it was coming from the pits into the Queen's Chamber, but I think it was the opposite direction. It was coming from the Queen's Chamber, flowing into these pits, and then down the plateau, converging in the Sphinx enclosure.
Okay.
Again, a close-up image of one of those silicate microspherules from the lightning strikes. All right, so now this is a paper. Again, I don't know why it's doing this, where the stuff that I highlighted is actually blocked out.
Can't see it, yeah.
Yeah, but this paper, telluric and earth currents, lightning strike locations, and natural resource exploitation, is a whole research paper talking about how telluric currents have a controlling impact on lightning strike locations. And there's a significant relationship between solar and lunar phenomenon and the occurrence of lightning, which gets into the function of Stonehenge, which was also designed as a solar and lunar observatory for tracking these phenomenon so that they could predict when these lightning strikes were going to occur.
Okay. Let's dig in.
It's again, the more I work on this, the more. So this is me investigating this huge iron oxide pit that's adjacent to the central pyramid.
Okay.
And this is just talking about, okay, so again, I was talking about Stonehenge. This is an image of Stonehenge, solar and lunar observatory.
What is the conventional theory for Stonehenge?
Basically the same thing. That's a widely accepted explanation for Stonehenge. Is that it's a astronomical observatory.
Right.
But I believe it was also designed to harness these lightning strikes.
Okay.
But it was absolutely used as a tracking device so that they could plan the conjunction of these solar and lunar phenomenon and accurately predict when these lightning strikes were going to occur.
Near Stonehenge.
Correct. I believe in the center of the structure.
In the center. So is Stonehenge up on like a big hill?
Yeah.
Okay.
And there was a central, it's now knocked over, and they call the center of Stonehenge a cell. And it's called the altar stone. It's now been toppled over, but it was originally the tallest of the stones inside of this structure, which would I believe would have been your obelisk or your pillar stone, your standing stone that harnessed these lightning strikes and distributed it into the bedrock.
Okay.
Okay, so this is the first White Horse Hill. You can see on the face of, you can't really see it in this picture, but there's a white horse inscribed in the side of the hill right there in that little depression.
When was that put there?
So that's a relatively modern addition.
Right.
And these were added to all of these hills where lightning phenomenon occurs naturally. As soon as I put out this episode, I was contacted by a ton of people that live in this area recounting that they used to watch thunderstorms move down these white chalk hills. And all of these hills are white chalk, which is the same chemical composition of limestone, but just a different geological process in the formation. So it's all calcium carbonate chalk, a dielectric material.
Is that similar to what you were saying accumulated on the insides of those shafts in the Great Pyramid? You said there was like a salt chalky substance.
That's calcium sulfate.
Okay.
Yeah, which is a reaction between sulfuric acid and limestone.
Okay.
So this is calcium carbonate chalk. The bedrock of all of these structures across England is all on a foundation of chalk bedrock. So Avebury is built on chalk. These White Horse Hills are built on chalk. Silbury Hill is made of chalk on chalk bedrock. And they selected these materials very intentionally because of these dielectric electric field storage properties. So you can see that the face of this hill has a scoop and an angle. I haven't tested it, but I would almost bet that this is the same angle as the slope of the face of the Great Pyramid.
51 point something
51
degrees.
and a half degrees,
Right.
correct, which is the ideal vector for sweeping a hot air front and a cold air front into the atmosphere that generates cumulonimbus clouds. So this is how the White Horse Hills of Wiltshire, England work. There was an obelisk or a standing stone at the top of the structure. You have the telluric currents flowing through the crust of the earth, causing dielectric polarization of the chalk material. So you have an accumulation of positive charges at the top and negative charges toward the bottom. This is going to attract your lightning strike, which chemically transforms the calcium carbonate into calcium oxide, releasing carbon dioxide. There's also a reservoir at the top of this hill, and there's a source of water running below this structure. There's modern water pumps at the bottom of this hill today. I think I have, the water pumps here.
Oh, wow.
So there's a water source where they could have pumped this water to the top of the hill to fill the reservoir. So the water pours down the face of the hill, and there's a chemical reaction that occurs between the calcium oxide and water to create calcium hydroxide, which releases an immense amount of heat. This is an incredibly windy area where there's air, wind currents sweeping off the surface of this hill. Very similar to what I kind of touched on with the Great Pyramid, where the black basalt floor adjacent to the Great Pyramid was heated. The air moving across that black basalt floor was swept into the atmosphere at the ideal angle to create this circulation of a hot air front and a cold air front that generates cumulonimbus clouds. This is exactly what's depicted here in this diagram, is that there is an interface between hot air front and cold air front that creates cumulonimbus clouds, lightning clouds. So again, it is a system for the generation. So first step is capturing naturally occurring lightning. That naturally occurring lightning is then distributed through the system to create a chemical reaction that creates more thunderstorm clouds and more lightning.
Wow.
The power source of all of these systems is a regenerative process where they were, I said this at the beginning, that these structures were designed to operate in conjunction with the forces of the earth.
Right.
So they're using these naturally occurring electric currents from telluric currents. They're harnessing the electric energy from lightning, and the whole thing works in a cycle, producing more and more lightning, more and more thunderclouds.
Wow, man.
And so again, in a thunderstorm, when you have a lightning strike, you have accumulation of negative charges in the cloud itself, and you have accumulation of positive charges. Here you can see the white horse.
Yep.
And then in the right corner, you can see the obelisk. And in the top, you can see the reservoir at the top of the hill. And you can see that it looks like water was flowing down from that reservoir down the surface of the hill. You see that
Yep.
Fluid erosion?
Yep.
It's literally pouring from that reservoir down into this valley, causing that chemical reaction that generates calcium oxide and generates an immense amount of heat sweeping off of that hill front.
So you think that this site was essentially doing the same thing that the Great Pyramid was doing?
Correct.
It's just a rudimentary version of it.
Correct. Yeah. So I believe that
But it was intentionally created that way.
Yes.
It was man-made.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So when we were hiking up this hill, both Alexa and I noticed that it appeared that the surface of this hill was terraformed. The whole hill could have possibly been man-made. And that's what we see in Silbury Hill, the proto-pyramid. It's the largest mound in Europe. It's a proto-pyramid that's made of chalk. And I'm pretty sure I have this in the slide deck, but this is just talking about this white horse symbol that permeates all of these ancient religions and mythology, symbolizing thunderstorm clouds and lightning. So on the surface of these ancient hills, they literally emblazoned it with the symbol, depicting exactly what the function of these things were.
Wow, man.
The white horse, the cumulonimbus cloud,
Right.
and lightning storm. So we talk about, you hear this mythology of secrets in plain sight. And there's a whole bunch of these white horse hills all over Wiltshire, England, that have the exact same configuration. You can see another one here on the right, where there's a scoop on the front of the hill, there's a scoop on the back of the hill, a reservoir at the top, and it featured a standing stone. So the exact same chemical reaction, lightning struck the standing stone, it was distributed into the chalk, creating calcium hydroxide, releasing heat. The water was pouring down the far side that you can see in this picture. You can see there's no outlet of the reservoir near the horse,
Right.
and there's also no erosion. But if you look at the other side, all of this has water erosion moving down the surface of the far hill.
Yeah.
The exact same function where the hot air system was sweeping off of the far side, the cold air front was coming off of the horse side, mixing in the atmosphere and creating cumulonimbus thunderstorm cloud. This is exactly what Randall Carlson was talking about. The slope angle of the Great Pyramid being the ideal vector for creating thunderstorm clouds. So they inevitably
they tied all that mathematics and sacred geometry into that thunderstorm generator that Malcolm Bendall is working on.
Yeah.
But they have a great way of explaining it very fast with complex math.
Sure.
Basically, that you get lost when you're trying to make sense of it.
Yeah.
But
I haven't delved into the mechanics of the thunderstorm generator, but I was watching your podcast with Randall, and he was talking about the slope angle, and then I knew that there was a connection between these two things. He's working on this modern machine, and it just so happens that it points to this exact same slope angle as being the ideal configuration for the generation of thunderstorm clouds.
right.
So again, there's interesting connections between my work and Dunn's work, my work and Randall Carlson's work, where it all works synergistically. The whole picture comes together. And I took this information from understanding the White Horse Hills of Wiltshire, England, and then I went back and I applied it to the Great Pyramid, and everything just clicked. The whole thing started to make sense. So again, the White Horse. This is Silbury Hill, a huge pyramid structure in very, very close proximity to these White Horse Hills. You can see that it also has a reservoir that was intended to be flooded. This is a huge hill that's made of chalk. And so you'll see here that the surface of this is flat.
Right.
That was intentional to allow the accumulation of positive charges at the top of the monument. So Yusuf and I did a test. So he has a machine, this machine that you can see down here called the life force generator. And this is one of these machines, I don't understand the mechanisms of operation that make the machine work, but it's supposed to generate an electromagnetic energy field.
Okay.
So we tested the properties of stone in electromagnetic field experiment number 1, and it shows that the charges that are stored inside of the limestone can be released if you give it a conductor, that piece of copper. If you put that piece of copper up against the red granite, nothing happens because the electric field is being used to create ultrasound. The electric field is dissipated inside of the red granite, which is the exact function of the red granite, is to use that electric field for the production of ultrasound. So there's no discharge when you put the piece of copper next to the red granite, but there is a discharge when you put it next to the limestone. In electromagnetic field experiment number 1, we tested amorphous shapes of limestone, red granite, black basalt, and calcite crystal. In experiment number 2, I had Yusuf carve a pyramid shape of limestone, and that's what we're testing here. And as you move to the top of the pyramid, the discharge completely disappears because there's no surface area on the apex of a pyramid. That is why the Great Pyramid was intentionally left without a capstone to provide more surface area for the accumulation of electric fields. Exactly what you're seeing here is the accumulation of these electric fields at the top of the Great Pyramid. Boom, I do have it in here, I think.
If you hit escape on that keyboard, you'll be able to see them all.
I might not have that. I think I put it in a separate episode because it was so deserving of a separate episode. But in with using one of the wavelengths of electromagnetic energy, the top of the pyramid completely turns red, indicating the highest accumulation of electric field.
Right.
And it stops literally at the top of the pyramid, exactly like you see here. And the capstone is blue, indicating that there would be zero accumulation of electric field in the capstone, quote unquote capstone. So I believe it was intentionally left flat, exactly like Silbury Hill was left flat, to allow the accumulation of these electric fields at the top of the structure. And this is again the paper that we were talking about before. Study reveals the Great Pyramid of Giza can focus electromagnetic energy, not only inside of the chambers, but also at the top of the structure.
Wow.
So you have lightning striking the top of the Great Pyramid. Okay, same accumulation of positive charges attracting these negatively charged lightning strikes. When you look at Silbury Hill, this massive mound of chalk, it's doing the exact same thing.
Right.
The telluric currents are flowing through the earth. Positive charges are accumulating at the top of the structure, attracting lightning. Same chemical reaction recurs, leaving calcium oxide. The reservoir is flooded, creating heat, to create your thunderstorm clouds. And it just so happens that Silbury Hill at number 1 on this diagram is located next to a structure called Windmill Hill. It's a wind hill. So the hot air coming off of Silbury Hill was sweeping off of one side of Windmill Hill. So you have all of this heat energy coming off of Silbury Hill, sweeping up one side of Windmill Hill, and the cold air front is coming in off the other side, creating these cumulonimbus clouds.
Now, how do we know it was warm on one side and cold on the other?
Well, so again, that chemical reaction, when the lightning strikes Silbury Hill,
Right.
it's going to create. So you have calcium carbonate, limestone.
Right.
You strike with lightning. Naturally occurring lightning is going to be attracted to the structure. It's going to create a chemical reaction that produces calcium oxide and releases carbon dioxide. You then have your calcium oxide. You flood the reservoir,
Yep.
and that releases heat. The chemical reaction between the water and the calcium oxide creates calcium hydroxide, which is an incredibly exothermic chemical reaction. The exact same exothermic reaction that I'm talking about inside of the Great Pyramid.
Right. And you said there was the black stone on the base of one side of the pyramid that would heat up the wind.
Correct. That allows for the storage of that thermal energy that they took from the void above the Grand Gallery. They moved that hot water. There's channels running underneath this black basalt floor. So that hot water would have moved through these channels, heated up the black basalt. And this exact same process happens where hot air is sweeping off of one side of the Great Pyramid at the ideal angle. The cold air is sweeping off the other side, creating these cumulonimbus clouds. So this is Avebury, the Serpent Temple complex that you can see here.
Yep.
That circle that has a head and a tail. So the tail end is at number 2. 6 and 8 is the main structure at Avebury, and then it goes over to a structure called the Sanctuary at number 10. Again, they call this a Serpent Temple complex because it not only looks like a snake, but it's also indicative of the function of the structure to attract and harness lightning strikes. The snake, the ancient symbol for lightning. So this is an entire system of ancient structures that include Avebury Serpent Temple complex, Silbury Hill, the West Kennet Long Barrows, which have a very similar configuration to Newgrange, all of these structures working in conjunction to produce and harness lightning, distribute those electric fields into the Long Barrows, which again are very similar to Newgrange, for electric field chemistry and also for sonocrystallization. It turns out that ultrasound can also be used to produce very pure crystals of ferrous sulfate. So these structures were all connected using this electric field energy.
Dude, this is wild shit, man. I mean, it makes so much sense. There's so much to it. But I really do think you're onto something here. I would love to listen to you and Chris Dunn sit down and go through this stuff for hours. That would be fascinating to have different people with different opinions sort of stress test each other's ideas. Would be fascinating.
So the ultimate goal of this is, of course, the melding of the minds, right?
Yes.
To get a group of people to come to Egypt, all with interdisciplinary expertise. Let's get a physicist. Let's get a geologist. Let's get a construction engineer. Let's get a chemist. Let's get all of these people together to analyze these structures and propose something that could actually be a solid foundation, right? So my book is a fictional book. It's about a young man's initiation into an ancient secret society that was responsible for the construction and operation of the Egyptian pyramids. And I wrote it as a fictional narrative as a vehicle for the transmission of the idea. There's a great quote by Rudyard Kipling that says, "If history were told in the form of stories, then it would never be forgotten." So I didn't have any sort of academic backing. I don't have the type of details to write a rigid academic publication. My original goal was to publish a research paper, but I was talking to my dad, and again, when he passed away, that was one of the big inspirations for me to move to Egypt, was that I realized when my dad died, we only get one shot at this life, and you have to capitalize on it and do it now. And my dream was always to wait until I retired, and I was going to move to Egypt after I retired. I work away my whole life in a career job, slave for the man, corporate America type deal. And maybe one day when I retire, I'll be able to move to Egypt. And then my dad passed away, and I had a very profound realization that the clock is ticking for all of us. And if there's a dream that you have, the time is now. And the exploration of the Egyptian pyramids is a young man's game. It's a pain in the ass to get down inside these things. And, if I had wait until I'm 65, there's no guarantee that you make it to that. And when I'm older, I may not have the physical capabilities to be able to do this. So it was a very profound, life-altering experience for me when my dad passed away, was the realization that if I was going to do this, I had to do it now. And it's made all of the difference in my entire life. The exponential growth of my channel, this opportunity, if my dad had passed away, I would probably never be here. Because I never would have moved to Egypt. I never would have put in 100% into what I was doing. I was working 90% of my life in a career job that I didn't care one bit about. I was making money, and I had a house, and I had a car, and I had all these beautiful things, and I could afford to travel back and forth to Egypt on these annual expeditions, but once a year wasn't enough. So I went all in. I sold everything. It's
beautiful, man.
And I left it all. And, I could get into the function of the Avebury Serpent Temple complex. I know we've been on forever, dude, and there's so much more to this story. And my only recommendation is, if you're interested in this material, come subscribe to the Land of Chem, CHEM, as in the land of chemistry. I have 125 research episodes talking in depth about every single aspect of this chemical manufacturing process. I also talk about Avebury, Stonehenge, Silbury Hill, all of these passage chamber structures of England and Ireland. And we have another research expedition coming up later this year that I'm not going to spoil, that's going to take us completely across the other side of the world to investigate some of these other ancient structures.
Well, I think everything that you've showed us today is overwhelming and incredibly fascinating.
Thank you.
The first time I've ever heard any kind of explanation like this in regards to these pyramids and chemical processing and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So thank you again for doing this.
Dude, it's again, I cannot express in words my gratitude for you, for having me on this show.
My pleasure,
for
man.
even being aware of my work and giving me the invitation and opportunity to do this. It means so much to me. There's so much more to cover. Again, we could go through easily 3 more hours, me discussing Avebury and the application of all this stuff, electric field chemistry, sonocrystallization, the function of Newgrange and West Kennet Long Barrow, and all this stuff. And the more I study these ancient structures, the more my research expands. It was originally just looking at step pyramid, red pyramid, bent pyramid, 2 pyramids on the Giza Plateau. But the more that I travel and the more that I learn about these ancient structures, the picture that I have painted of the integration of physics and chemistry into the function of these sites, literally the whole picture becomes very, very clear. And that's what I was talking about, where it has to be a comprehensive explanation that can be applied to all of the structures and give a reasonable explanation for all of the differences that we find in them.
Yeah, I totally agree, man. We should talk about a couple more things and the Serapeum boxes.
Yeah.
But let's wrap up the podcast, and we can do that on Patreon. So people that want to go
Sure.
to my Patreon or whatever, they can go watch the rest of it. But we got to keep this thing to a certain length.
Yeah.
Again, thank you. I'll link all your shit below.
It's my pleasure, man. Thank you so much. It means the world to me.
And everyone needs to go support you. Subscribe to Jeffrey's channel, sign up for the tours, get the merch.
The Land of Chem,
Land of Chem,
CHEM.
baby.
Yeah. And this is just the tip of the iceberg of things that are coming. And the more sites that we go visit, I don't want to spoil the surprise, but I have a huge research expedition coming up later this year that's going to blow this thing wide open.
That's awesome.
And again, the parallels between all of the independent research, the connections between what Christopher Dunn is proposing, again, a pioneer of this field, what Randall Carlson is working on with the thunderstorm generator, them realizing that the slope angle of the Great Pyramid is ideal for this vector of hot and cold air. And then my research with the chemistry and physics, there's a connection between all of this. And again, is indicative of a vein of truth that runs through all of this. So get us all in touch, and then we can all come sit down and have
will.
the big round table discussion.
I will.
Yeah,
Yeah,
man.
we got to get you guys all in here together. That
That would be awesome. Yeah.
We'll do a marathon.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's keep going on Patreon. If you guys want to keep watching, you can jump down there. And good night, everybody.